He walked into one of the most powerful buildings in New York City, carrying nothing but a sealed envelope and a phone. And within 60 seconds, a man who thought he ran the room crushed that phone beneath his boot like it was garbage. 10 seconds after that, the entire skyscraper went dark. Billions of dollars froze. Alarms screamed through 47 floors, and the only person who could stop what was coming stood quietly in the lobby, watching the chaos unfold with the calm eyes of a man who had survived things that would break most people in half. Nobody knew who he really was. That was about to change. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and stay with me until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't expect. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The storm had been building since 4 in the morning. By 7, it owned Manhattan. Rain came down in hard, diagonal sheets that turned the sidewalks into rivers and made the yellow cabs look like they were swimming rather than driving. Thunder rolled in from the Hudson and shook the windows of the high-rises along 6th Avenue. And most people who had any choice in the matter stayed exactly where they were, in bed, in coffee shops, in the warm silence of somewhere that wasn't outside. Nathan Cross didn't have that choice. He'd promised himself he would be here by 7:30, and Nathan Cross did not break promises he made to himself. That habit had kept him alive in places most people couldn't find on a map. He came up from the 47th Street subway entrance with water already soaking through the collar of his jacket, a gray thing worn at the elbows, the kind you'd find at the back of a closet after years of not needing it. He hadn't worn a suit in a long time. He'd thought about it this morning, standing in the narrow bedroom of his apartment in Woodside, Queens, looking at the one decent blazer he still owned. Then he'd thought about the 40-minute commute in the rain and the fact that the blazer had a small ink stain on the left cuff that he'd never been able to get out, and he'd put it back on the hanger. The gray jacket would have to do. He stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, let the rain hit him, and looked up at Blackstone Global's headquarters. 47 floors of steel and glass rising out of the Midtown grid, like something that had always been there and intended to keep being there long after everything around it was gone. He'd seen photographs of the building dozens of times over the past 11 years, but photographs didn't give you the weight of it, the way it pressed down on the street below just by existing. He adjusted the strap of his bag, a plain canvas messenger bag with a broken buckle he'd been meaning to fix for 6 months, and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was the kind of space designed specifically to remind you that you didn't belong there. 40 feet of polished marble ceiling, security desks that looked like they'd been imported from a country that took architecture personally, employees moving with the particular efficiency of people who knew their badge would open every door in the building and had never once stopped to wonder what it felt like not to have one. Nathan crossed the lobby floor toward the main security desk, his wet sneakers squeaking against the marble in a way that felt genuinely embarrassing. A few people glanced at him. Most didn't bother. There were 3 guards at the desk. The one in the center was large, not just tall but constructed, the kind of big that takes years of deliberate effort, with a square jaw and the flat, practiced stare of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have sorted every person who walked through those doors into one of 2 categories before they even opened their mouth. The nameplate on his jacket read, E. Dalton, Head of Security. Nathan set his bag down on the counter, reached in, and placed the sealed envelope on the desk beside it. "I need to see Victoria Langford," he said, "before the board meeting." Eric Dalton looked at the envelope, then at Nathan, then, slowly, at the wet sneakers. "Name," he said. "Nathan Cross." Dalton typed something into his terminal, waited, looked at the screen with the expression of a man who already knew what he was going to find, which was nothing, and had been hoping for exactly that result. "You're not in the system," he said. "I wouldn't be." "You have an appointment?" "No, but Margaret Hale contacted me directly and asked me to come in this morning. I need to speak with Ms. Langford before—" "Margaret Hale." Dalton's eyebrows moved slightly. "The founder." "Yes." Dalton looked at Nathan again, took in the full picture, the wet jacket, the worn canvas bag, the broken buckle, the way this man's hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain, and he didn't seem bothered by it at all. "Sir," Dalton said, and there was already something in his voice that didn't sound like respect. "Ms. Langford is in pre-meeting preparation right now and cannot be disturbed. Ms. Hale is not in the building. If you don't have an appointment and you're not in our system, then call her, Nathan said. Call Margaret Hale. She'll confirm. I can't do that without authorization. She's expecting this envelope. Nathan placed his hand on it, not pushing, just steady. The contents are time sensitive. The board meeting starts in 40 minutes, and what's in here matters to what happens in that room. If you don't pass this along and something goes wrong because of that, that's a conversation you're going to have with your CEO. Dalton stared at him for a long moment. Around them, the lobby was filling up. The morning rush had begun. Employees swiping in through the turnstiles, executives crossing with coffee cups and rolling briefcases. A cluster of what looked like junior analysts standing near the elevator bank, checking their phones. A Thursday morning in a 47-floor corporation. Ordinary. Wait here, Dalton said finally. He moved away from the desk and made a call on a private line, turning his back. Nathan watched him, didn't lean on the counter, didn't check his phone, just stood there with his hands loose at his sides, which was a thing that people who'd spent a long time in operational environments tended to do without thinking about it. Keep the hands visible, keep the body relaxed, don't telegraph. His phone was in his jacket pocket. It was not a normal phone. It was a fully encrypted unit running a custom operating system on hardware that had been modified to a spec that no commercial carrier would recognize. It weighed more than a regular phone and was ugly in the deliberate way that functional things sometimes are. No polish, no curves, just a thick slab of matte black with a recessed screen and a chassis that could survive things regular phones couldn't. He'd had it for 3 years. It had been with him through 6 time zones and one situation he still didn't fully talk about. The call on that phone was scheduled for 7:50. He had 22 minutes. Dalton came back. His expression had changed in a way that was subtle but readable. Something had shifted in the conversation he'd just had, and not in the direction he'd expected. He looked at Nathan with a new kind of attention. "Who did you say you were?" he said. "Nathan Cross? And your connection to this company is what, exactly?" "That's what the envelope is for." Dalton's jaw tightened. He was being handled, and he could feel it, and he didn't like it. Nathan understood that. He'd been on the other side of that feeling enough times to recognize it. "I'm going to need you to leave the bag on the desk and come with me," Dalton said. "I'm going to need to see some identification, and I'm going to need to understand exactly what's in that envelope before it goes anywhere near Ms. Langford's office." "That's fine," Nathan said. "But the phone stays with me." "The phone?" Nathan tapped his jacket pocket. "It stays with me. There's an incoming call at 7:50 that cannot be interrupted." Dalton looked at the pocket. Back at Nathan. Something in his expression had closed off now. The moment he'd been almost willing to consider that this might be a legitimate situation had passed, and something harder had taken its place. "Sir?" he said, and now the sir was definitely not respectful. "In this building, no one—" "I understand your procedure," Nathan said quietly. "I'm not trying to cause a problem. I'm asking you to do one thing. The phone stays with me, and the call is not interrupted. Everything else, I'll cooperate completely." The lobby had gotten louder around them. Nathan was aware of people looking. Not many, but some. A security officer who'd drifted closer to the desk. A woman in a tailored navy suit who'd paused near the elevator bank with a coffee cup held halfway to her mouth, watching. Dalton made a decision. He was a man who had spent 15 years working security for a global corporation, and in 15 years, nobody had ever walked into his lobby in wet sneakers and told him what was going to happen. Nobody told Eric Dalton what was going to happen in his lobby. That was the point of the lobby. That was the point of him. "I need to see the phone," he said. "No." The word landed flat and final, and the silence after it was maybe 2 seconds long, which felt much longer. Then Dalton reached forward and pulled the phone from Nathan's jacket pocket. Nathan didn't grab for it. He didn't raise his voice. He went very still in the particular way that some people go still when something has just happened that cannot be undone. And he looked at Dalton with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something quieter than anger, and somehow worse. "You need to put that back," he said. Dalton held the phone up, turned it over in his hand, looked at it. He'd seen plenty of high-security government hardware in his career, and he recognized what he was holding. He recognized it, and that made him angry, because what reason did this man in a worn gray jacket and wet sneakers have for carrying a piece of equipment like this? "Where did you get this?" he said. "Put it back." "Sir, I'm asking you a legitimate security question." "Eric." Nathan said his name with a precision that was almost surgical. "That phone is the most important thing in this lobby right now. You need to put it back in my jacket, and you need to take me to Victoria Langford, and you need to do both of those things in the next 30 seconds. What happened next was one of those moments that people remember differently depending on where they were standing. Dalton would later describe it as a security judgment call. Other people in the lobby that morning would describe it differently. He dropped the phone on the marble floor, and then he put his boot on it. The crack was loud enough that people near the elevator bank flinched. The screen shattered, the chassis split along one edge, and something inside it that had been running continuously for the past 16 hours died. There was a beat of silence. A few people had fully stopped now, watching. The woman in the navy suit had set her coffee down. Dalton stepped back and looked at Nathan with the expression of a man who had just definitively ended an argument. "Now," he said, "you want to tell me who you really are and what you're actually doing in this building. Because right now, what I'm seeing is a potential security threat who refused to comply with a legitimate..." The alarm started. Not one alarm. All of them. Every floor simultaneously. The lobby lighting shifted to emergency red within seconds. The turnstiles locked with a sound like gunshots, every single one at once, and then the main entrance doors sealed with a hydraulic thud that Nathan could feel through the floor. The screens on every terminal at the security desk went blank. Someone at the far end of the lobby made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but was heading in that direction. Dalton spun toward his desk. His terminal was dark. He grabbed his radio. Dead. He tried his cell phone. No signal. 47 floors of Blackstone Global went into complete lockdown in the span of 10 seconds, and in the financial district, servers carrying transactions worth $4.7 billion in pending activity froze mid-execution, suspended in a state that none of the engineers monitoring them could explain, because the system that had triggered the shutdown wasn't any system they knew existed. Nathan crouched down and picked up the broken phone. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. The chassis was split, the screen was gone, and the indicator light that had been blinking on the side since he'd activated it at 6 this morning was dark. He stood up. The lobby had gone from a normal Thursday morning to something that nobody had a procedure for, and in the middle of it, Nathan Cross, wet jacket, broken buckle, ruined sneakers, was the only person who didn't look afraid. Dalton turned back to him. His face had changed completely. The authority was still there, or trying to be, but underneath it something uncertain had moved in. "What?" he started. "The call at 7:50, Nathan said. "That was the handshake. The system needed to verify the line was active." Dalton stared at him. "It's not active anymore," Nathan said. He looked at the broken phone once more, then tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket. "Which means the system is now running in contingency mode, and contingency mode does exactly what you're seeing." Around them, people were calling out, trying doors, looking at their blank phones with the particular panic of people who had never once considered what it would feel like to be inside a locked building with no connection to anything outside it. Dalton's voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been before. "Who are you?" Nathan looked at him, not unkindly, just directly. "Someone who needs to talk to Victoria Langford," he said, "before this gets worse." And somewhere in the building, 31 floors above their heads, in a conference room where a board of directors was preparing to make decisions that would reshape one of the most powerful companies in the country, a door opened, and footsteps began moving quickly down a corridor toward the nearest stairwell. Because Victoria Langford had a security monitor in her office, and she'd been watching the lobby feed for the past 4 minutes. She'd seen the phone go down, and she'd recognized the man holding it. The stairwell door on the 31st floor opened with a sound like a held breath finally released, and Victoria Langford moved through it at a pace that her assistant, a nervous 26-year-old named Paul, who had been with her for 8 months and had never seen her move like this, had to jog to match. She was 30 years old, which was younger than most of the people who reported to her, and she had spent the better part of the last 4 years making sure that fact never showed on her face. She was not tall. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a way that was practical rather than styled, and her suit was charcoal gray and well-fitted, and she had a habit when she was thinking hard of pressing her thumbnail against the inside of her opposite wrist without knowing she was doing it. She was doing it now. Paul kept up with her for 2 flights before he had to say something. "Ms. Langford, the board is expecting you in 20. The agenda hasn't been circulated yet, and Mercer's been asking, "Tell Damien the meeting is delayed," she said without slowing. "By how much?" "I don't know yet." "He's not going to—" "Paul." She stopped on the landing between the 28th and 27th floor and looked at him. He was holding his tablet against his chest like a shield. "Tell him there's a security situation. Tell him I'm handling it personally. Tell him anything that buys me 30 minutes. Can you do that?" He swallowed. "Yes." "Good. Go back up. Don't let anyone into the boardroom until I say so." She left him on the landing and kept moving down. The lobby, when she came through the stairwell door, was a different place than it had been 40 minutes ago. The emergency lighting had shifted the whole space into something that felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like a place where things had gone wrong. People were clustered near the walls and the elevator banks, some of them on dead cell phones, some of them just standing with the specific helplessness of people waiting for someone else to explain what was happening. 3 of Dalton's security officers were at the main entrance trying to manually override the door locks with a tool that wasn't working. Dalton himself was standing 6 feet from the man in the gray jacket, and whatever conversation they'd been having had apparently reached a stopping point, because neither of them was talking. They were just looking at each other in the way that 2 people look at each other when one of them has recently been proven wrong about something significant, and neither of them has fully processed what comes next. Victoria crossed the lobby. People moved out of her way. Not because she asked them to, but because something in the way she moved made it clear that stopping her was not an option anyone wanted to exercise. She stopped in front of Nathan Cross and looked at him. He was about what she'd expected from the monitor footage, and not at all what she'd expected from anything else. Medium height. Lean in the way that people are lean when it's structural rather than cultivated. The gray jacket was soaked through at the shoulders, and there were deep tiredness lines around his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much, and he was holding a broken phone in both hands with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something they weren't ready to let go of yet. He looked at her and didn't seem surprised to see her, which itself surprised her. "Ms. Langford," he said. "Mr. Cross." She kept her voice level. Around them, people were watching. "You want to tell me what just happened to my building?" "Contingency protocol," he said, triggered automatically when the primary verification line went dark. "The phone." "Yes." She looked at the broken thing in his hands, then at Dalton, who had the expression of a man who had been hoping she wouldn't look at him. "Eric," she said. "Ms. Langford, I had reason to believe this individual was a potential. We'll talk about that later." She looked back at Nathan. "Can you bring the building back online?" "Some of it," he said. "Not all of it. Not from here." "What does that mean, not all of it?" He glanced around the lobby. Not nervously, just cataloging, the way you look at a room when you're calculating how much of what you're about to say should be said in front of how many people. "It means," he said carefully, "that the lockdown is the least of your problems this morning, and I'd rather explain the rest of it somewhere that isn't the middle of your lobby." Victoria studied him for a moment. She'd been running Blackstone Global for 2 years, and in 2 years she'd learned to read people faster than she had any right to, because the alternative was getting read first, and she'd already seen what that cost. The man in front of her wasn't performing. He wasn't nervous in the way that people who were lying to her were nervous. He was tired and wet and holding a ruined piece of equipment, and he was telling her in the flattest possible terms that something was very wrong. She'd suspected that herself for about 6 weeks. She just hadn't had anything she could point to. "Come with me," she said. She took him to the 4th floor operations room rather than her office, because her office had windows that faced the main corridor, and she didn't want anyone watching this conversation from outside the glass. The operations room was internal. No windows, a long table with terminals on one side, and a wall of monitoring screens that were currently all dark because everything in the building was dark. She sent the 2 technicians who were in there scrambling at their equipment out into the hall and closed the door. Dalton she kept. She kept him because she needed him to hear this, and because there was a part of her that was still running security protocol in her head even when the rest of her was doing something else. Nathan set the broken phone on the table. "Margaret Hale called me 12 days ago," he said. Victoria's expression shifted slightly. Just slightly. "From where?" "Her home in Connecticut. She used a landline." He pulled the sealed envelope from his bag and set it beside the broken phone. "She told me she'd found something, that she needed someone she trusted to look at it before she knew what to do with it. And she trusted you, Victoria said. It wasn't quite a question. We've known each other a long time, he said, since before Blackstone was what it is now. He sat down across from her, which was either natural or deliberate, she couldn't tell. 11 years ago, when Margaret was in the early stages of building the company's infrastructure, she brought me in to design the security architecture. Not the physical side, the systems, the network, the encrypted communication protocols, the authentication layers, the fail-safe structures that sit underneath everything else the company runs on. Victoria was very still. I wasn't told that. Margaret thought it was better that way. At the time, I agreed with her. He paused, which was the first time she'd seen him pause. I was getting out of another line of work. I wanted to do something that kept me out of the public record. She understood that. Dalton, who had been standing near the door with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was reassessing several recent decisions, said, "What other line of work?" Nathan looked at him steadily. "The kind where you don't put it on a resume." The silence that followed that was the kind that fills in its own blanks, and Dalton let it. "The envelope," Victoria said. Nathan nodded. Margaret found something in the company's internal transaction records, routing patterns that didn't match anything on the official ledgers. Small amounts, scattered across dozens of subsidiary accounts over 14 months, moving in a pattern that someone who wasn't looking specifically for it would never notice. He folded his hands on the table. But she was looking for it because she'd seen the same kind of pattern before. 22 years ago, in a company she'd invested in that got hollowed out from the inside before anyone realized what was happening. Victoria opened the envelope. Inside were 11 pages of printed financial records, annotated by hand in Margaret Hale's sharp, angular writing, the handwriting of someone who had been taking notes in margins their whole life. Victoria turned through the first 3 pages without speaking. Dalton moved around the table to look over her shoulder, and she didn't stop him. "Who else has seen this?" she said. "Margaret and me," Nathan said, "and whoever put it together." Victoria looked up. "Damian Mercer," she said. Nathan didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "I can't prove it's him directly from this," he said. "Not yet. The accounts are shelled, 3 layers of subsidiary companies, 2 of them incorporated offshore, and the routing goes through a clearinghouse in Luxembourg that's going to take forensic accountants weeks to fully unravel. But the structure of it," he touched one of the annotated pages, "the way the pattern is built. It's designed by someone who knows exactly how Blackstone's internal accounting architecture works. Who knows where the gaps are in the monitoring systems? Who knows which transaction categories get the least regulatory scrutiny?" "That's a short list," Dalton said. "Yes," Nathan said. "It is." Victoria set the pages down. She pressed her thumbnail against the inside of her opposite wrist and stared at the dark monitoring screens on the wall for a moment. Outside this room, her building was in lockdown. Her board of directors was gathering for a meeting that was supposed to finalize a major strategic partnership, and her most trusted advisor, the man who had been beside her since her first week as CEO, who had shepherded her through every significant decision she'd made in 2 years, who she had defended in front of skeptical board members 3 separate times, was apparently in the process of dismantling everything she'd built. She'd been suspicious. She hadn't wanted to be. "The lockdown," she said. "How much of it can you bring back online?" "Internal communications first," Nathan said. "I can restore the building's internal network from the emergency access node in the server room on sublevel 2. That brings the terminals back, the intercoms, the internal phone lines. But I'm not bringing the external connections back until we know what we're dealing with." "Why?" "Because whoever set this up knew I was coming." He said it flatly, without drama. "The false intelligence that tagged me as a security threat in your system. That wasn't random. Someone put that there. Someone who knew Margaret had contacted me, or figured it out, and that someone has had 12 days to prepare for what happens when I walk through that door." Dalton's jaw worked. "The security flag," he said. "On your name. I pulled it up before It looked like a legitimate internal threat assessment." "It was fabricated," Nathan said. "The metadata was clean. Whoever built it knew what your verification protocols look like from the inside." "That's not a capability that—" Dalton stopped. He looked at Victoria. Something in his face had shifted from reassessing to something closer to hollow. "That's not something an outside actor could pull off. That's someone with direct access to our internal security infrastructure. Yes, Nathan said. The room was quiet for a moment. Rain was hitting the building somewhere above them, a low, continuous sound against the concrete. We need to get to the server room, Nathan said. Sub-level 2. From there I can restore partial function, and also... He looked at the broken phone again. There are fragments of what was on that phone that might still be recoverable. The chassis is cracked, but the internal storage isn't physically destroyed. There's equipment in your IT security suite that can pull data from a damaged unit. What kind of data? Victoria asked. Margaret sent me something the night before last, he said. Encrypted file transfer, routed through the verification system on the phone. I hadn't fully opened it yet. I was waiting until I was in the building to do it, because opening it outside triggers a secondary authentication that would have flagged the signal. Whatever she sent me, it's still on there. Or most of it is. Most of it, Dalton said. The phone took some damage, Nathan said, looking at him with an expression that was not accusatory and somehow worse for it. I don't know yet what's intact. Dalton said nothing. We can't go through the main corridor to sub-level 2, Nathan said. The lockdown sealed the primary elevator banks, and the main stairwells feed into the lobby, which is currently full of 300 people who have no idea what's happening. I don't want to move through that. He paused. Is the maintenance corridor network still accessible from this floor? Victoria looked at Dalton. It should be, Dalton said slowly. Maintenance corridors run on a separate mechanical circuit. They're not part of the primary security grid. He was working through something in his head as he said it. There's an access point 2 doors down from this room. It connects to the vertical utility shaft on the building's north face. You can get from there to sub-level 2 without going through any of the main floors. Do you have a key? Nathan asked. Dalton reached into his jacket and produced a physical key on a steel ring. Old style, the kind that maintenance systems still used because electronic keys were more hackable than people like to admit. He held it for a moment, looking at it, and then he held it out to Nathan. Nathan took it. I'm coming with you, Dalton said. I know, Nathan said. He stood. I was counting on it. Victoria stood as well, and both men looked at her with the specific expression of people who were about to tell a woman in charge that she should stay somewhere safe. Don't, she said. Miss Langford, Nathan started. Don't, she said again, and something in her voice closed the subject. It's my building. It's my company, and apparently someone inside it has been working for months to take it from me. She picked up the 11 pages of annotated records and folded them back into the envelope. I'm not sitting in a room waiting for someone to tell me what's happening in my own house. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Whatever calculation he was running resolved itself quickly. Stay between us, he said. Do exactly what I say when I say it. If I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to get down, you get down. Understood. And I need you to understand something else. He held her eyes. The people who built this, they are not amateurs. What looks like a corporate fraud situation has contingencies that go beyond financial. Margaret didn't just find an accounting irregularity. She found something that made her scared enough to call me on a landline from her private home and ask me to come in person. Margaret Hale does not scare easily. Victoria felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the building's ventilation. She'd known Margaret Hale since she was 22 years old. Margaret had recruited her, mentored her, handed her the reins of a company worth $11 billion with the steady certainty of someone who didn't make that kind of decision lightly. In 8 years of knowing her, Victoria had never heard Margaret Hale described as afraid. What exactly did she tell you on that call? She said. Nathan picked up his bag. She told me that if anything happened to her before I got here, I should assume it wasn't an accident. The maintenance corridor behind the operations room was narrow and smelled like concrete and insulation and old electrical work, the bones of the building, the parts that existed purely to make the visible parts function, never meant to be seen. The ceiling was low enough that Dalton had to angle his head slightly, and the only light came from a strip of emergency LEDs along the floor that cast everything in a flat, directionless white. They moved in single file. Nathan first, then Victoria, then Dalton, who had, in the last 20 minutes, said very little, which was a significant change from the man who had commanded a lobby full of people 3 hours ago. He was carrying the weight of the broken phone without being told to. He hadn't asked to. He just picked it up off the operations room table when they were leaving, tucked it carefully into his jacket pocket, and followed. Nathan moved through the corridor without hesitation, which was notable given that he hadn't been in this building in over a decade. He moved like someone following a blueprint in his head, which, Victoria realized, was exactly what he was doing. He had designed these systems. He had walked through these corridors at some point in a past that no one at Blackstone knew about, and the building was still carrying the shape of choices he had made before she'd ever sat down in the CEO's chair. At the junction between the fourth-floor corridor and the north-face utility shaft, Nathan stopped. He crouched and looked at the floor near the shaft access panel, and then looked at it longer than he needed to. "What is it?" Victoria said. He pointed. In the thin LED light, barely visible against the concrete floor, scuff marks. Fresh ones. The kind left by shoes with a specific sole pattern, overlapping in the way that happens when someone has stood in a spot for a while rather than walked through it. "Someone's been through here recently," he said. "This week, I'd guess." "Could be maintenance," Dalton said. "Could be," Nathan said. He didn't say anything else, just stood and opened the shaft access panel and started moving again. The utility shaft dropped 6 levels on a service ladder bolted to the wall. Bare metal rungs, slightly greasy, running through a concrete column that housed the building's primary mechanical and electrical feeds. Victoria had been in this building for 2 years and had never known it existed. She climbed down it now in her good charcoal suit with both hands on the cold rungs, counting floors, listening to the sound of Nathan's movement below her and Dalton's above. On the sub-level 2 landing, Nathan stopped them with a hand gesture before he opened the access panel. He pressed his ear briefly to the metal, held it there for 5 seconds. Then he pushed through. The sub-level corridor was wider than the maintenance shaft and significantly less empty than it should have been. There were 2 men in the hallway between them and the server room, and they weren't wearing Blackstone maintenance uniforms. They were wearing them imperfectly. The fit was wrong, the badge placement was wrong, and one of them was holding a tablet computer with the kind of rigid attention that security contractors use when they're trying to look like they belong somewhere they don't. Nathan had already stopped. He'd pulled Victoria back against the wall on his left side, and his hand was out to signal Dalton without looking behind him. 2, he said, very quiet. Right side, 12 feet. Dalton moved up beside him and looked. His face changed. "I don't recognize either of them," he said under his breath. "And I know every maintenance staff member on this building's roster." "How many access points to this corridor?" Nathan said. 2. This one and the service entrance at the east end. "What's between us and the server room?" "Fire door, 40 feet down." The 2 men hadn't looked up yet. The one with the tablet was doing something on the screen with focused attention. The other was standing with his back half-turned, looking toward the east end. Nathan said quietly, "There's a panel in the wall between us and them. Electrical junction box, I'd guess. It's on the schematic I remember. Is it still there?" Dalton looked. "Yes." "Does it connect to the emergency lighting circuit for this sublevel?" Dalton understood what he was asking. "It would. I need 30 seconds in a direction." What followed was not graceful or cinematic or anything like the way these things were depicted in movies. It was fast, and it was functional, and it was over before the second man finished turning around. The sub-level corridor's emergency lighting flickered and cut for 4 seconds. Not total darkness, but enough. When it came back, both men were on the floor with zip restraints from Dalton's belt kit, and Nathan was breathing slightly harder than he had been before, and his jacket was torn at the left shoulder seam. He looked at the tear, said nothing about it. "You're bleeding," Victoria said. He checked his arm. "A scrape, not deep." "It's fine." "It's not fine, it's not important right now," he said. Not unkindly, just the way someone talks when they're already on to the next problem. He looked at Dalton. The server room. Inside the server room, it was cold and loud with the white noise of cooling systems. The kind of room that exists in every large building and that almost no one who works in the building ever enters. Rows of black server racks lit with small blue indicator lights that had stayed on through the lockdown because they were on an isolated power circuit that Nathan had designed specifically to survive contingency events. He sat down at the primary access terminal and began working. Victoria stood behind him and watched his hands on the keyboard, and she understood perhaps 40% of what she was seeing, which was more than most people would have managed. She watched the terminal screen populate with structures that looked like architectural diagrams, Not physical architecture, but the map of a system, the skeleton of something built 11 years ago and living still inside her company's infrastructure like a second nervous system nobody else had ever learned to read. There, he said, more to himself than to her. He opened a directory and stopped. What? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Someone's been in here, he said. Inside the system. Not the surface layer. The deep architecture. The parts that require my original authentication credentials to access. He turned to look at her. They have my credentials. The weight of that took a second to land. How is that possible? Dalton said. It means they had access to something I gave only to Margaret, Nathan said. A recovery document. A fail-safe I built in case. Something happened to me and the company needed someone to be able to access the core systems. I gave it to her in a sealed physical document 12 years ago, and I never made another copy. He looked at the screen. Someone opened that document. The room was quiet except for the server noise. They've already been inside the foundation of your security architecture, he said. They know how it's built. They've been mapping it from the inside, looking for a way to use it. He turned back to the keyboard. Which means the board meeting today isn't just a routine session. Whatever they're planning, today is when it happens. He pulled up the internal communications network and began restoring it layer by layer. Not all at once, not the external connections, just the internal lines. On the wall panel to his right, a single indicator light came on green, and then another. He then pulled the broken phone from Dalton's jacket pocket. Dalton handed it over without being asked, and connected it via a short cable to a secondary port on the terminal. He typed a recovery sequence from memory, didn't look at his hands while he did it. The screen populated with fragments, partial files, incomplete data pulled from a damaged storage unit, pieced together by a recovery protocol he'd embedded in the phone's architecture for exactly this kind of situation, because Nathan Cross had spent years in environments where things broke and you still needed what was on them. He read the fragments. His face was very still. She sent me the names, he said. Names, Victoria said. The accounts. The people behind the shell companies. The ones Damian Mercer has been routing money to for 14 months. He pointed at the screen. 3 of them are board members. 2 of them are on the executive committee. He paused. And 1 of them is a federal official who's been running interference on the regulatory side, making sure none of the transaction flags triggered a real investigation. Victoria put both hands flat on the desk beside the terminal and looked at the screen. She read the names. She recognized 4 of them immediately, people she'd sat in rooms with, people she'd shaken hands with, people who had looked her in the eye across a conference table and told her they supported her vision for this company. She felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere in the territory between them. The board meeting, she said. What's happening in that room today? Nathan pulled up another fragment. This one took longer to render. It was a partial document, portions unreadable, but enough of it was intact. A vote, he said. An emergency resolution. Mercer's been building the coalition for it for 3 months. He needs 7 of 12 board members to carry it. He has 8 committed. He traced a line on the screen. The resolution removes you as CEO on the grounds of financial mismanagement. There's a forensic audit already queued to begin the moment the vote passes, and the audit document has been prefabricated to support the accusation. The moment you're removed, a transition team takes operational control. Mercer becomes interim CEO within 48 hours. And the technology, Victoria said. The core platform goes with him. It's been quietly transferred into a subsidiary structure over the past 6 months in a way that would take years of litigation to untangle. By the time anyone figured out what had happened, Blackstone's most valuable asset would already be somewhere else. Victoria straightened up. She looked at the names on the screen one more time, fixing them in her mind with the particular coldness of someone deciding not to waste any more feeling on a situation that had moved past the feeling stage. How long before Mercer realizes the lockdown isn't doing what he expected it to do? She said. Nathan looked at the time display on the terminal. He was probably expecting the lockdown to isolate you and buy time for the board session to start without you present. When he figures out it hasn't, he calculated, 20 minutes, maybe less if he has someone monitoring the building's systems and they notice I've accessed the server room. Then we have 20 minutes. Maybe less. She looked at him. He looked back at her, not with reassurance, which she would have found condescending, but with the steady attention of someone who was already working through what came next and needed to know she was doing the same. "What do we need to do?" she said. He turned back to the terminal. "We need to recover as much of Margaret's data as we can. We need to get it into a format that can be verified independently, and we need to get you into that boardroom before Mercer can get the vote started." He paused. "And I need to know that Margaret is safe." He said the last part differently than he'd said the rest of it. Not softer exactly, but with a specific weight that the other words hadn't carried. "She's at her home in Connecticut," Victoria said. "As far as I know." "Call her," Nathan said. "Use the internal line. It's back online. Her personal number will be in your executive directory." He didn't look away from the screen while he said it. "Call her right now." Victoria moved to the wall-mounted internal terminal beside the door and pulled up the directory. She dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. Then a recording. Not Margaret's voice, a standard automated message, the kind that means the voicemail box hasn't been set up or has been cleared. Victoria looked at Nathan's back. He hadn't turned around, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. "She always answers," Victoria said. "I know," Nathan said. He kept working. His hands moved across the keyboard with the same steadiness they'd had since the lobby, the same control, but something behind it had tightened in a way that only showed if you were watching carefully, and Victoria was watching carefully. She was beginning to understand that the man in the worn gray jacket had not come here this morning simply because Margaret Hale had asked him to. He had come here because he already knew what was at stake, and because some people, when they understand that something is genuinely wrong, don't wait to be asked twice. Outside the server room, somewhere in this building above them, 31 floors of Blackstone Global were shifting from confusion into something more deliberate. And in a boardroom with a long mahogany table and 12 chairs and a view of Manhattan in the rain, a door was being closed and locked from the inside by a man who believed he had already won. The internal line rang 4 more times before Victoria set the receiver down, and neither she nor Nathan said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything useful to say. Margaret Hale was 71 years old and lived alone in a house in Westport, Connecticut, and she always answered her phone. That was a fact Victoria had accumulated across 8 years of working with her. The woman picked up on the second ring regardless of the hour, regardless of where she was. Because Margaret Hale believed that unanswered calls were a form of rudeness she had no patience for. The automated message playing in her place was not a small thing. It was the kind of absence that has a shape to it. Nathan finished pulling the last recoverable fragments from the broken phone and transferred them to an encrypted partition on the server room terminal. He did it without being told to, without explaining what he was doing in real time, just working with the focused economy of someone who had learned a long time ago that narrating your own actions was a luxury you couldn't always afford. The tear in his jacket shoulder had bled through the fabric in a small dark patch, and he hadn't looked at it again. "What did you get?" Victoria said. "Enough," he said. "Not everything. The authentication file she sent me is about 60% intact. The rest is corrupted past recovery. But the 60% includes the core transaction records, the subsidiary account structure, and 3 of the 5 names I couldn't read clearly before." He pulled up the reconstructed document on screen and turned the monitor so she could see it. "There's enough here to open a federal investigation. It's not enough to stop a board vote in the next 20 minutes. "Then what stops the board vote?" "You walking into that room," he said, "before it starts. Before Mercer can get 7 signatures on a procedural motion to begin without you present. Once that motion passes, you're locked out of your own boardroom under company bylaws, and everything that happens inside it is legally valid with or without you." Dalton, who had been standing near the door running his own calculations in silence, said, "What's the state of the building right now? If I tried to reach the boardroom from here, what am I walking into?" Nathan pulled up the internal network map on a secondary screen. The lockdown had created a specific geography, certain corridors sealed, certain stairwells accessible, the passenger elevators all frozen at their last position when the system tripped. He'd designed the lockdown architecture himself, which meant he understood it in the way that only a builder understands their own structure, knowing not just what it did but why it did it, and where the logic had seams. "Main stairwells are sealed from lobby level up to 12, he said. "Above 12, the internal pressure locks disengage because the fire code requires egress above the 11th floor, regardless of security status. You can move freely from 12 upward if you can get to 12. He traced the route with one finger. From sublevel 2, the utility shaft gets you back to the 4th floor maintenance corridor. From there, the east wing has a secondary stairwell that feeds into the 12th floor mechanical room. That's your path up to 31. My path, Dalton said. Not yours. Nathan looked at him. Someone has to go to Connecticut, Dalton said. He said it the way a person says something they've been deciding for a minute and have now decided. Margaret called you. She's not answering. You said yourself, if anything happened to her, assume it wasn't an accident. Someone needs to get to that house. And it can't be you because you're the only person who can get Ms. Langford into that boardroom through whatever's waiting up there. He paused. So it's me. The room was quiet except for the server noise. You're not law enforcement, Nathan said. If there are people at that house, I spent 11 years in private security before Blackstone, and 6 before that doing things I'm also not putting on a resume, Dalton said. He met Nathan's eyes and held them. I know how to handle a situation, and I owe that woman something. He didn't specify which woman he meant, and he didn't need to. Both applied. The phone I destroyed had information she sent to you. If she's in trouble right now, part of that is on me. Nathan was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't hesitation. It's assessment. He was looking at Dalton the way you look at a piece of equipment you're about to trust with something important, checking for the things that don't show up on the surface. The external communications are still locked, Nathan said. Once you're outside the building, you're on your own. No contact until I restore external lines, which I'm not doing until we know who's monitoring the network. I'll manage. Margaret's address is in the executive directory, Victoria said. She crossed to the terminal and pulled it up. 14 Candlewood Road, Westport. The property is gated, but the code is 1987. It's been the same for years. She refuses to change it. She wrote it on a piece of paper from the terminal's printer tray and handed it to Dalton. He took it and folded it once and put it in his chest pocket. There's a vehicle access point on the building's north service road, Nathan said. The lockdown sealed the main entrance and the parking structure, but the service road gate runs on a mechanical override. Pull the red handle on the left post. It bypasses the electronic lock. There should be maintenance vehicles behind the north wall. Dalton nodded. He looked at Nathan for a moment with an expression that had several things in it. Some of them uncomfortable, none of them simple. I shouldn't have touched the phone, he said. Nathan looked at him. No, he said. You shouldn't have. I'm saying I know that. I know you are. They held each other's gaze for a second, and then Dalton turned and moved back into the maintenance corridor, and the sound of his footsteps receded quickly in the way that purposeful people move when they've made a decision and are no longer second-guessing it. Victoria watched the door settle shut behind him. She turned back to Nathan. Tell me what we're actually walking into up there, she said. He saved the recovered data to an encrypted drive, a small device he pulled from his bag, matte black, thumb-sized, which he plugged into the terminal, waited for the transfer confirmation, and then pocketed. He shut the terminal down cleanly, leaving nothing in the active memory. Mercer has people in the building, he said. Not just the 2 we found down here. The men in the maintenance corridor were positioned there to delay access to the server room, which means he anticipated that someone might try to restore the internal network from this location. He knows this building's architecture, or someone who works for him does. How many people? I don't know. Enough to have covered this corridor and probably at least one other critical access point. He picked up his bag. The ones at the executive floor level will be the ones that matter. If he's built this the way I think he has, there are people positioned to control who gets into that boardroom and who doesn't. Under the cover of the lockdown, he can move them around the building without anyone questioning it. Everyone's already confused about what's happening, so 2 men in wrong-fitting uniforms standing in a hallway doesn't stand out the way it normally would. So getting to the boardroom isn't just a matter of finding a path, Victoria said. No, it's a matter of getting through whatever's guarding the path. He looked at her. How many people on your executive floor do you trust completely? Not professionally, not based on their record. Actually trust. She thought about it honestly rather than quickly, which he noticed. Paul, my assistant, she said. He's young. He doesn't fully know what he's doing half the time, but he doesn't have an angle. He's not built that way. She paused. Caroline Marsh, Chief Legal Officer. She's been at this company longer than I have, and she has never once told me what I wanted to hear instead of what was true. Where's Marsh right now? She was in her office when the lockdown started. 31st floor, south corridor, 2 doors from the boardroom. Can you reach her on the internal line from here? Victoria went back to the wall terminal. The internal network Nathan had restored was partial but functional. The 31st floor was connected. She dialed Caroline Marsh's direct extension. It rang twice. Then a voice, dry, precise, and currently operating at a controlled tension that the precision was working hard to contain. "This is Marsh." "It's me," Victoria said. "Don't say my name." A short silence. "I'm listening." "Are you alone?" "I sent my assistant out 10 minutes ago. He was making me anxious." A pause. "I'm alone. What's happening up there?" "Mercer has been in and out of the boardroom for the past 40 minutes. He's been talking to directors individually. I can see the corridor from my office window. 6 of them have gone in, come out, gone back in. Something is being organized, and it's not the agenda I was given this morning." Another pause, and this one had something careful in it. "Someone came to my door 20 minutes ago. Building security," he said. "Told me to stay in my office until the lockdown was resolved and not to access external communications. I told him I understood." Her voice was neutral as concrete. "I didn't recognize him. I've worked in this building for 9 years and I didn't recognize him." "He wasn't building security," Victoria said. "I had a feeling." Marsh's voice didn't change, but something behind it settled, the way things settle when a suspicion is confirmed and you no longer have to spend energy doubting yourself. "What do you need?" "I need you to get to the boardroom before the meeting starts and keep it from starting without me. Use a procedural motion if you have to. Request a quorum audit. Request that the agenda be recirculated. Anything that buys time. Can you do that without it being obvious?" "I've been practicing corporate obstruction for 30 years, Marsh said. "I can manage subtle." A beat. "Are you safe?" "Working on it." "How long do I have to stall?" Victoria looked at Nathan. He held up both hands, 10 fingers. 10 minutes, Victoria said. "Maybe 15. "I'll do what I can," Marsh said. "Move fast." And she hung up, which was the most Caroline Marsh thing possible. Victoria set the receiver down. "Let's go." The route from sub-level 2 back up to the 31st floor was not something that could be called simple, even with Nathan knowing every junction and access point from memory. The utility shaft was harder going up than it had been coming down. The rungs were the same greasy cold metal, and the climb was 6 floors instead of none, and Victoria's shoulders were burning by the 3rd floor, in a way she didn't mention because mentioning it wouldn't change anything. Nathan moved above her at a pace that was steady and unhurried, which she was starting to understand was not his natural state so much as a discipline, the deliberate management of pace by someone who knew what it cost to burn out early. They came back into the 4th floor maintenance corridor and moved east toward the secondary stairwell. Nathan paused at each junction for 2 or 3 seconds, listening, before moving through. The second time he did it, Victoria found herself doing the same thing automatically, and she wasn't sure when exactly that had started. The secondary stairwell smelled like dust and old paint and the particular staleness of a space that functioned but was never occupied. They climbed. Nathan counted floors under his breath, not anxiously, just tracking. On the 14th floor landing, he stopped. Voices. Above them. 1 floor up, maybe 2, carrying down the concrete shaft with the hollow amplification of enclosed spaces. They both went still. 2 voices. One of them issuing directions in a low, controlled tone, the other responding in the clipped affirmatives of someone taking instructions. Nathan listened for 30 seconds. Victoria watched his face. He was parsing the words, but he was also listening to something underneath the words, something in the cadence and the spacing, and she couldn't quite follow what he was reading from it. He leaned close to her ear. 2 of them. 15th floor landing. They're covering the stairwell from 15 to 20. After 20, the secondary stairwell connects to the main corridor network, and that's where their coverage matters. "Can we get past them?" she whispered. "Not through the stairwell." He thought for a moment. "There's a cross corridor on this floor that connects to the central building core. From there, the fire escape on the east face. It's exterior, it's in the rain, but it's not covered because it's not on Mercer's map of the building's internal network. You want to go outside?" "I want to get you to 31, he said. "Outside is faster and safer than through." She looked at him. Rain was still hammering the city somewhere beyond the concrete walls. Her charcoal suit had already survived a maintenance shaft, a sixth-floor utility climb, and whatever she'd brushed against on the fourth-floor corridor wall that had left a gray smear on her right sleeve. Going up a rain-soaked exterior fire escape felt, in the context of everything else, like a manageable problem. "Let's go," she said. The cross corridor on 14 connected to the central core through a door that required the maintenance key Dalton had given Nathan, and the fire escape access on the east face was a heavy push-bar door that opened onto a metal landing with a grated floor and a view of the city and the storm that was, despite everything, briefly stunning. The midtown skyline swallowed in low gray cloud, rain coming sideways at this height. The streets 40 stories below running with water and yellow cab light, and the compressed movement of a city that didn't stop for anything. Victoria pushed the door shut behind her and grabbed the railing with both hands as a gust came off the river and tried to decide her direction for her. The metal was slick and cold, and the grating under her feet shifted slightly in a way she chose not to think about. Nathan was already moving up. She followed. The fire escape switchbacked up the building's east face in the standard pattern. Landing, stairs, landing, stairs. Each landing marked with a floor number stenciled in fading red paint. They climbed in the rain and the wind and didn't talk because there was nothing to say that was worth the breath it cost. On the 23rd floor landing, Nathan's foot went through a gap where a grating section had rusted partially loose, and he caught himself with both hands on the railing and pulled his foot out and kept going without pausing, though Victoria saw the way he landed on that foot for the next 2 flights and adjusted without acknowledging it. They reached the 31st floor landing at 7 minutes past the 20 they'd estimated, which was 7 minutes past what Victoria had told Caroline Marsh, and she had no way to communicate that. The fire escape door on 31 was not locked from the outside, which was the fire code in which Nathan had been counting on. He pushed through it into a corridor that was dim with emergency lighting. The executive floor ran on the main power circuit, and the lockdown had dropped it to backup illumination, which meant the long hallway of glass-walled offices was half-lit, the usual ambient light gone, everything slightly shadowed and strange. It was also not empty. There was a man at the far end of the corridor by the junction that led to the boardroom. He was standing with his back to a wall, and he was not reading anything, not on a phone, not performing the normal behaviors of someone who belonged in a corporate hallway at 8:15 in the morning. He was just standing there. Nathan saw him at the same moment Victoria did. He put his hand back without looking, a flat gesture. "Stop," and she stopped. They were in the shallow alcove of the fire door, not yet fully in the corridor. The man hadn't looked their way. "One," Nathan said, very low. "Just one?" "That I can see." He looked at the corridor geometry. The boardroom was at the far end, past the man, past the junction. Caroline Marsh's office was 3 doors down from their current position on the right side. "I need to know if there's someone inside the boardroom already." "Mercer will be in there," Victoria said. "He's been in and out all morning." "And the directors?" "Some of them. If Caroline's been managing the delay, the full quorum won't be seated yet." Nathan studied the man at the end of the corridor for a moment. He was built differently than the 2 they'd found in the sublevel, leaner, and carrying himself with a stillness that was harder to read. Not building security, not maintenance. Someone who had done this kind of work before, which meant whoever Mercer had hired for this had not skimped on the quality of his insurance policy. "I need you in Marsh's office," Nathan said. "Door number 3 on the right. If I can move him away from that junction, you have a clear path." "What are you going to do?" He was quiet for half a second. "Make noise in the right direction." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." He looked at her. "When I move, you move, not before. You stay in Marsh's office until I come for you or until you hear the boardroom doors open. If you hear those doors open, you go through them regardless of what else is happening. You need to be in the room." She wanted to argue with the logic of this, but the logic was sound and she knew it, which was the frustrating part. She pressed her back against the wall of the alcove and nodded. What Nathan did next was not what she expected, which was the point. He didn't go toward the man. He went the other direction, back through the fire door, letting it close behind him, and then a moment later there was a sound from above, muffled through the door, like something heavy shifting on the exterior landing. Then nothing for 4 seconds. Then the fire escape door 2 floors up, 33rd, opened and shut with a sound that carried down the exterior shaft clearly enough to reach the corridor through the wall. The man at the junction reacted to it. He straightened, reached for a radio on his belt, said something she couldn't hear, and then began moving, not toward her position, but toward the central core stairwell, which was the logical path to the 33rd floor from the executive level. He passed her alcove without looking at it. She waited until his footsteps had turned the corner and gone into the stairwell. Then she moved. 3 doors on the right. She pushed through without knocking, and Caroline Marsh looked up from behind her desk with the expression of a woman who had been waiting and was profoundly tired of it. "You look terrible," Marsh said. "I've had a morning," Victoria said. Marsh stood. She was 61 and had the bearing of someone who had survived enough corporate crises to have stopped dramatizing them. A small, economical woman with silver hair cut close and eyes that evaluated everything once and quickly. She looked at the smear on Victoria's sleeve, the state of her hair, the absence of the calm, composed presentation that Victoria brought to every ordinary day in this building. "Tell me what you know," Marsh said. Victoria told her. Not everything. There wasn't time for everything. But the shape of it. Mercer. The accounts. The forged evidence. The board members who had already committed to the vote. The men in the building who weren't who their uniforms said they were. Marsh listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities, and when Victoria finished, she was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "The vote," Marsh said. "He needs 7 of 12. Who are the 8? Victoria named them. Marsh's expression as she heard each name was controlled, but not fully. On the 4th name, something shifted around her eyes that she pulled back quickly, but not before Victoria saw it. "Ringgold," Marsh said. "I wouldn't have guessed Ringgold." "Neither would I. He's been on this board for 14 years. Marsh said it almost to herself, in the tone of someone updating a file they'd thought was complete. Then she put it away. "The 3 who aren't committed to him, Wallace, Shen, and Park. They're in the boardroom now. I've been keeping the meeting from formally opening by requesting that the agenda packet be resent because I claimed mine was corrupted in the lockdown. That bought about 8 minutes. She looked at the clock on her wall. "I have perhaps 3 more before Mercer stops being patient with me." "Then we need to be in that room in 3 minutes, Victoria said. "Where's Nathan Cross?" Victoria realized she'd been talking about him without using his name, and Marsh already knew it. "How do you know that name?" "Margaret told me about him," Marsh said. 6 days ago. She called me from a landline, which she has never done in 9 years, and she told me that if something happened and I found myself needing to trust someone in this building who wasn't on the official record, I should trust Nathan Cross." She paused. "She didn't tell me he'd look like he'd been through a flood tunnel." "He's resourceful," Victoria said. "Clearly." Marsh picked up a folder from her desk. Thick, physical documents, paper-clipped. "I've been preparing this for 4 days. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing it for, but I've been pulling every transaction flag that crossed my desk in the last 6 months that felt wrong and documenting the irregularities in a format that holds up legally." She handed it to Victoria. "It's not proof of Mercer's involvement specifically, but it's enough to demand an independent audit that would freeze any board action pending review." Victoria took the folder. "You've been building a case." "I've been being careful," Marsh said, "which is not the same thing but sometimes produces the same result." The door behind Victoria opened, and Nathan came through it with rain still dripping from his jacket and his left shoe, making a wet sound on Marsh's office floor. He stopped when he saw Marsh and read the room in the way he read everything, quickly and without making a show of it. "Caroline Marsh," he said. "Mr. Cross," Marsh said. "You have about 2 minutes before someone comes to my door again." "I know." He looked at Victoria. "The man from the corridor is going to figure out the noise was a distraction in about 4 minutes. There may be a second person coming from the stairwell side. I heard a radio response when I was on the exterior. Someone acknowledged his check-in, which means there's at least one more working this floor." He looked at the folder in Victoria's hands. "What is that?" "Marsh has been documenting transaction irregularities independently," Victoria said. "Not the same material as what I recovered from the phone, but corroborating." Something changed in Nathan's expression. Not relief exactly, but the small recalibration of someone who has been working with incomplete equipment and has just been handed a part that fits. "Combined with what I recovered, it's enough," he said. It won't put Mercer in prison today, but it's enough to prevent the vote from standing and to get federal eyes on this before close of business. He looked at Marsh. Can you present it formally? In the room? That's what I do, Marsh said simply. Then we go now, he said. All three of us, together, through those doors before they can formally open the session. He moved to Marsh's office door and cracked it, looked. The corridor was clear in both directions. The man who'd been at the junction was still in the stairwell chasing a ghost, and whatever second presence was working, the floor hadn't come around yet. He held the door and looked back at Victoria. She straightened her jacket. She couldn't do anything about the sleeve smear or her rain-flattened hair or the fact that she was about to walk into a boardroom full of people who had spent months conspiring to take everything from her. She picked up Caroline Marsh's folder and held it against her chest like armor, which it partly was. One thing, she said to Nathan before they moved. He looked at her. Margaret, she said it quietly, when this is over. Dalton's already on his way, he said. He knows what to look for. He held her gaze for one more second, not with reassurance, because he wasn't the kind of person who trafficked in reassurance when he didn't know the outcome. Just steady, present. The look of someone who understood the weight of what she'd just said and wasn't going to minimize it by pretending it away. Then he turned and moved into the corridor, and they followed him. The boardroom doors were 12 feet of dark mahogany set in a frame that was meant to signal the importance of what happened on the other side of them. Nathan reached them first, pushed both handles simultaneously, and stepped back to let Victoria walk through first, because what came next was not his fight in the same way it was hers. She walked in. The room went quiet, in the way that rooms go quiet when something enters that changes the nature of the situation, and Victoria Langford stood in the doorway of her own boardroom in a ruined suit with rain-flattened hair and a folder of evidence pressed against her chest, and looked at 12 people, 8 of whom had spent months trying to ensure she would never stand in this spot again. Damian Mercer was at the far end of the table. He was 53 and polished in the way that years of money produces. Silver at the temples, suit that fit the way suits fit when you don't check the price. He looked at her the way you look at something you expected to have dealt with already. Victoria, he said. And then, after a half-second that betrayed more than he intended, the meeting was about to... The meeting hasn't started, Caroline Marsh said from behind Victoria, moving past her to take her seat at the table. She set her copy of the transaction documentation in front of her and folded her hands on top of it with the specific composure of someone who has been waiting to do exactly this. I haven't received a corrected agenda, and we don't have quorum on procedural. We have 9 directors present, Mercer said, and his voice was controlled, but something underneath it was moving fast. We have 12 directors on this board, Marsh said, and before we discuss quorum, I'm entering a formal request for an independent audit review under Section 14 of the company charter, which requires that all pending board actions be suspended pending. Caroline, Mercer's voice sharpened. This is not the time. It's exactly the time, Victoria said. She walked to her seat at the head of the table. Every eye in the room tracked her. She sat down, set the folder in front of her, and looked at Mercer with the clear, steady attention of a 30-year-old woman who had climbed a fire escape in the rain this morning and was not remotely finished. I'd like to call the meeting to order, she said. There are some things this board needs to see. Behind her, Nathan Cross stood in the doorway of the boardroom, not entering, not sitting, just there. In the worn gray jacket, torn at the shoulder, damp from the rain, holding nothing except the encrypted drive in his jacket pocket and the broken phone that had started all of this. He watched the room, watched Mercer's face as the man processed that the morning had not gone the way he'd built it to go. Watched the 3 uncommitted directors, Wallace, Shen, and Park, sit forward in their seats with the instinct of people who understood that something important was happening and wanted to be on the right side of it. And somewhere across the city, in the rain, a car with a determined man at the wheel was moving north toward the Connecticut border, carrying the weight of a mistake that couldn't be undone but might still matter. Nathan stood in the doorway and did not sit down, because the kind of people who design security systems and climb fire escapes and carry broken phones across locked buildings have learned from long experience that a situation is not over simply because the next phase has begun. He stood and watched, and he was right to, because Damian Mercer was looking at him now, across the length of the boardroom, And the expression on Mercer's face was not the expression of a man who had run out of options. It was the expression of a man who had been saving one. The expression on Damian Mercer's face lasted about 3 seconds before he put something else over it, a kind of managed composure, the professional mask of a man who had spent decades learning to look unrattled, regardless of what was happening underneath. But 3 seconds was enough. Nathan had read faster signals in worse light under considerably higher stakes, and what he'd seen in those 3 seconds told him that whatever Mercer had been holding in reserve, the decision to use it had just been made. Nathan stepped fully into the boardroom and moved to the right side of the room, away from the door, away from the table's main axis. He did it without explaining why, without drawing attention to the movement if he could help it. He wanted his back to a wall and a clear sightline to both the main doors and the secondary exit on the room's south side. A service access behind a panel that most people in this room didn't know existed, but that he'd noted on the building schematics 11 years ago, and that his memory, for better or worse, had retained. Victoria had begun speaking. She'd opened the folder Caroline Marsh had prepared and was laying documents on the table in front of the nearest directors. Wallace first, then Shen, then Park. The three who hadn't committed. The three who were still deciding what kind of people they were going to be in this room today. She was talking in the measured, precise cadence of someone who had prepared for this moment. Not in the last hour, but in the accumulated experience of 2 years of running a company while understanding, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the ground beneath her was not as solid as it looked. "These are transaction records from the past 14 months, she said. "The irregularities have been documented independently by our chief legal officer and cross-referenced against recovered encrypted data that I'll enter into the formal record this morning. What you're looking at is a pattern of systematic financial extraction routed through shell subsidiaries that were created specifically to avoid internal monitoring. Director Wallace, 64, white-haired, a man who had been on the Blackstone board for 9 years, and who had the particular stillness of someone who processed information deeply before responding, turned through the first 3 pages without looking up. His face gave nothing away, which Nathan read as a good sign. Men who were already committed to the wrong side didn't read carefully. They already knew what they thought. Mercer said, "Victoria, what you're presenting is a selective and deeply misleading interpretation of routine subsidiary restructuring that has been reviewed and approved at the Luxembourg routing," Marsh said, not looking up from her own copy. "Walk me through the Luxembourg routing, Damien, specifically the 14 transfers between March and August that went through Callaway Partners into the Helix Group account structure. Routine subsidiary restructuring doesn't need 3 layers of offshore holding companies to clear a corporate transaction." Mercer's jaw tightened. "Caroline, you're not a forensic accountant." "No," she said. "I'm a lawyer who's been reading corporate documents for 30 years, and I know what normal looks like. This isn't it." Director Shin, youngest of the 12 at 47, a woman who had made her own considerable money in technology before joining the board, and who had always struck Victoria as someone allergic to being in the wrong room, set her pages down and looked directly at Mercer. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him, and the quality of that look had a weight to it. Nathan was watching the room and watching the doors simultaneously, which was a thing that required a specific kind of attention. Not divided exactly, but layered. He'd operated this way for years in environments where the threat could come from the conversation you were watching or from the door you were monitoring, and the skill of it was knowing that both were real, and that you couldn't afford to let either one collapse into background noise. The south panel hadn't moved. The main doors behind him were still. Whatever Mercer had decided to use, it hadn't arrived yet. Mercer stood. He did it the way powerful men stand when they've decided the discussion has moved past the point of discussion. Slowly, with the specific authority of someone who believes the room belongs to them. "Board members," he said, and his voice had shifted into something more formal, more rehearsed, the voice of a prepared statement. "What's happening here is a last-minute attempt by a CEO whose performance has been significantly below expectations to derail a legitimate governance review by presenting unverified documents that have not been through any proper legal or financial vetting." He looked around the table. "We have 9 directors present. We have a valid agenda. I'm calling for the vote to proceed under emergency charter provisions, which require only a 2/3 majority of present directors to..." "That provision requires the CEO to be absent or incapacitated," Marsh said. "Ms. Langford is neither. She's sitting at the head of her table." The provision requires the CEO to be unable to fulfill her duties due to a company security situation, Mercer said, which we currently have. The building is in lockdown. The building is in lockdown because someone inside it manufactured a security crisis to create exactly this pretext, Victoria said. She kept her voice even, and we have documentation of that as well. She reached into the folder and placed Nathan's recovered data printout on the table. It wasn't the full file. The full file was on the encrypted drive in Nathan's pocket, but she'd printed the core transaction structure in the server room before they'd left sublevel 2. And what was on those pages was clear enough that you didn't need a forensic accountant to understand the direction it pointed. Mercer looked at the pages on the table. Something crossed his face that he controlled quickly, but Nathan caught it. The specific expression of a person who has just seen something they believed was secure turn up somewhere it shouldn't be. He looked from the pages to Nathan, standing at the wall, and for a moment the two of them held each other's gaze across the length of the room. Mercer said very carefully, "Where did those come from?" "The security architecture your people tried to access this morning," Nathan said. It was the first time he'd spoken since entering the room, and several directors turned to look at him with the sudden attention of people who hadn't fully registered his presence until he used it. The system flagged the intrusion. The data was already copied to an isolated partition before they got in. "Who is this man?" Director Reingold said. He was in his 60s, heavy-set, and he asked the question with the particular irritation of someone who feels that an unauthorized person has wandered into a space he considers controlled. Nathan remembered that name from the list on the server room terminal. "His name is Nathan Cross," Victoria said. "He designed the security architecture this building has been running on for 11 years. The architecture that your colleagues' hired operators spent the last week trying to break into." "That's a completely unsubstantiated," Reingold started. "It's on the access logs," Nathan said. "Time-stamped intrusion attempts going back 6 days, originating from a terminal that was authenticated using credentials belonging to the company's founder. Margaret Hale's credentials." He looked at Mercer. "Which she didn't give anyone permission to use." The room had shifted. It was a subtle thing, not dramatic, not the way these moments were in movies, but real and measurable. 3 of the 8 directors who had come into this meeting committed to Mercer's agenda were no longer looking at Mercer. They were looking at the documents. They were doing the calculation that people do when the ground under a decision starts to feel different than it felt when they made it. Mercer understood what was happening. Nathan watched him understand it, watched the recalculation move behind his eyes, and then watched him arrive at the decision that Nathan had been anticipating since the boardroom door opened. Mercer said, "I need a brief recess." "The meeting hasn't formally opened," Marsh said. "You can't recess a meeting that—" "5 minutes," Mercer said. He was already moving, away from his chair, away from the table, toward the south side of the room, the service panel side. "There are materials I need to retrieve from my office that are directly relevant to the board's deliberations, and I'm entitled under charter to a reasonable—" "Damien," Victoria said. He stopped, turned. "Sit down," she said. She said it quietly, the way you say something when you're not asking. For a moment, Mercer and Victoria looked at each other across the boardroom table, and in that moment, Nathan saw the full shape of what this was. Not just a corporate conspiracy, not just financial fraud, but 2 years of proximity and trust, and the particular intimacy of working closely with someone you thought was on your side, now resolved into its actual nature. Victoria's face was steady. Mercer's was working to be. He didn't sit down. He moved another 2 steps toward the south panel, and Nathan moved away from the wall. Mercer said, without turning around, "I'd think carefully about what you're doing, Cross." "I'm standing in a room," Nathan said. "That's all. You have no authority here. You're not an employee. You're not a law enforcement officer. You have no legal standing to—" "He doesn't need legal standing to stand in a room," Marsh said dryly, not looking up from her documents. Mercer turned. He looked at Nathan with the expression of a man putting down his last card, and Nathan had seen that expression before in different contexts. The moment when someone transitions from the version of the situation where they win through strategy to the version where they do something else instead. "There's something the board should know," Mercer said. He raised his voice slightly, addressing the table rather than Nathan. "This man, Nathan Cross, was not invited here by Victoria Langford or by the company's security protocols. He was contacted by an 81-year-old woman who has been showing signs of cognitive decline for over a year, and he used that relationship to gain unauthorized access to this building and to this company's most sensitive security infrastructure." He paused. "Asking is not what he found in our systems. It's why he was in our systems at all, and who authorized him to be there, and what else he may have accessed or compromised." It was good. Nathan had to acknowledge that. It was the kind of move that worked in rooms full of people who didn't know the full picture. Take the information your opponent has exposed and reframe the source as the threat. It was the kind of argument that could buy 20 minutes of doubt, and 20 minutes of doubt was enough. Director Wallace looked up from his documents. He looked at Nathan with the careful, deliberate attention of a man genuinely trying to evaluate something. "Mr. Cross," Wallace said, "did Margaret Hale authorize your access to Blackstone's security systems?" "She asked me to come to this building this morning," Nathan said. "The access I used was built on credentials that were always mine. I designed the system and I retained root-level access as part of the original agreement with Miss Hale. It was never revoked because it was never made part of the official record, which was a decision Ms. Hale and I made together at the time." "Why?" Wallace said. "Because we thought there might come a day when the official record wasn't the safest place to put certain capabilities," Nathan said. "Given this morning, I'd say that assessment held." Wallace held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the documents again. Mercer said, "That is precisely the kind of unauthorized shadow infrastructure that creates massive legal liability for this company, and the board." The main doors opened, not the service panel, the main mahogany doors, both of them, and they opened with the specific force of people who were not waiting for permission to enter. Two men came through first, suits, federal IDs clipped to jacket pockets, the flat, efficient movement of people who had been briefed and knew where they were going. Behind them, a woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped gray hair and a blue jacket with 3 letters on the back that reorganized the atmosphere of the room immediately and completely. Behind her, and this was the thing that Nathan had not allowed himself to anticipate, because allowing yourself to anticipate things that might not happen was a form of preparation that cost more than it was worth. Behind her, supported on one side by Eric Dalton's arm, and moving carefully but under her own considerable will, was Margaret Hale. She was 71 years old, and she had a bandage on her left forearm that disappeared under her sleeve, and she was walking with the slight stiffness of someone managing pain they'd decided not to let slow them down. She was wearing a wool coat that was the color of old moss, and her white hair was not fully composed, and she looked at the boardroom with the eyes of a woman who had built this company from a concept in a conference room in a midtown sublet in 1983, and who had not, despite what certain people had spent considerable resources attempting, been finished. She looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at her. The room was completely silent. "Hello, Damien," Margaret Hale said. Her voice was the same as it had always been, dry and precise, and carrying in it the specific authority of someone who didn't need volume because they'd never needed volume. She crossed to a chair at the side of the room, not the table. She was no longer the CEO, and she knew what the room required, and sat down with the careful deliberateness of someone who was in pain and was not going to show it any more than was absolutely unavoidable. Dalton met Nathan's eyes from across the room. He had road grime on his jacket, and his hair was wet from rain, and there was a cut on his chin that was the kind of cut you get from moving fast through an environment that wasn't designed for it. He looked like a man who had driven to Connecticut and back in a storm in about 90 minutes and had not spent any of that time being comfortable. He nodded at Nathan. Nathan nodded back. The federal agent with the gray hair, she identified herself to the room as Special Agent Patricia Rowan, Financial Crimes Division, set a briefcase on the side table and opened it without ceremony. She looked around the boardroom with the measuring attention of someone cataloging a scene for later reference. "We've been building a parallel investigation for 4 months," she said, "coordinating with 2 overseas regulatory bodies and a separate federal wire fraud inquiry. The materials recovered from this building's security system this morning, transmitted to our office approximately 40 minutes ago, completed the evidentiary threshold we needed." She looked at Mercer. "Mr. Mercer, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges including securities fraud, wire fraud, corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit assault on a 71-year-old woman at her private residence, which occurred at approximately 7 this morning." Director Reingold said, "I need to speak with my attorney." "That's your right," Agent Rowan said. She looked at him with the specific patience of someone who had heard exactly that sentence many times. Two of my colleagues will be happy to facilitate that from wherever you'd like to make that call. The second federal agent, who had positioned himself near Reingold without appearing to, made a small gesture toward the door. Reingold looked at it, looked at the agent, and stood without further comment. Mercer had not moved. He was standing where he'd been standing when the doors opened, near the south panel, and he was doing the thing that people do when the version of events they've built their entire strategy around has just been replaced by a different version. He was very still, and his face was working through something that had too many components to resolve quickly. "This is," he started. "4 months, Nathan said. He wasn't being cruel about it. I was just providing information, the way you correct a factual error. They've had 4 months. Whatever you built, they've been inside the edges of it longer than you knew." Mercer looked at him. The mask was coming apart now. Not dramatically, not all at once, but at the seams, the way expensive things come apart when the structure underneath finally gives way. "You have no idea," Mercer said, and his voice had dropped. "What this company would have been under proper management. The opportunities he gestured vaguely toward Victoria. The deals she's walked away from. The partnerships she's refused. Do you know how much money has been left on the table because of her principles?" "Damien," Margaret Hale said from her chair. He looked at her. "Stop," she said, not unkindly, with the tiredness of someone who had known this man for 22 years and was watching something she'd hoped never to watch. "Just stop." He stopped. Something went out of him that had been holding him upright in a particular way, and what was left was just a man in an expensive suit standing near a door in a room that no longer belonged to him in any of the ways he'd intended. Agent Rowan moved toward him with a quiet efficiency, and Mercer didn't resist, which Nathan had assessed as likely from the moment he'd read the final card come down. The men who built the kind of conspiracy Mercer had built were planners, not fighters. Their violence was financial and architectural, and when the structure collapsed, they tended to collapse with it. The room had several conversations happening simultaneously now. Federal agents and directors, Marsh moving methodically through documents with one of the investigators. Victoria, at the head of the table, speaking in low, urgent tones with Wallace and Shen and Park. The 3 uncommitted directors who had sat forward when she walked in were still sitting forward, and they were asking questions that sounded like the questions of people trying to understand rather than people trying to survive. Nathan stood at the wall and watched all of it and said very little, because there was very little left that required him specifically, and knowing when you've done what you came to do is its own discipline. Margaret Hale looked at him from across the room. He crossed to her. He pulled a chair close and sat down so they were at the same level, which felt correct given that she was managing pain, and he didn't want her to have to look up. "You look like you've had a morning," she said. "You have a bandage on your arm," he said. "I have several things wrong with me at the moment," she said. "I was managing when your man arrived. I want you to know that." "I know," he said. "He said you met him at the door." "I was not going to open it for anyone who wasn't someone I trusted, so I looked through the window first." She paused. "He has a very recognizable face. Guilty people have a specific look." He felt guilty about the phone. "Yes, he told me, at some length." She looked toward where Dalton was standing, near the main doors, watching the federal agents work. "He drove very fast, I'll give him that." Nathan looked at her arm. "What happened?" "2 men were outside the house. I realized they were there before I let them know I'd realized, so I had a few minutes." She said it with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone describing a scheduling inconvenience. "I got out through the back. One of them was faster than I anticipated. The bandage is from a garden wall, not from him. I fell rather than was pushed, which is a distinction that matters to me personally." She looked at him directly. "Nathan, the file I sent you, how much of it survived?" "Enough," he said. "Combined with what Marsh had built independently and what Federal has been building for 4 months. Yes," she said. "Patricia Rowan called me 8 weeks ago. She'd found the edges of it through a separate inquiry and needed someone inside the company to verify what she was seeing was what she thought it was." Margaret's mouth compressed slightly. "I should have come to you sooner. I kept thinking I could manage it more quietly." "You managed it," he said. "We managed it," she said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of someone who knows a person well enough to see past the surface of what they're presenting. "How's your arm?" He'd forgotten about the scrape. He looked at his sleeve. The dried blood had made a small dark mark on the gray jacket that he'd probably had since before Ella was born, and which he would now have to either clean or retire. "It's fine," he said. "You always say that." "It's always approximately true." She almost smiled. Not quite. There was too much in the room for quite, but the shape of it was there. "How is she?" She meant Ella. She was one of 3 people outside of Queens who knew his daughter's name, and she'd asked about her every time they'd spoken in 11 years, which was not often, but was consistently. "She's 7 now," he said. He stopped because the honest answer was complicated in the way that answers about children are always complicated when you're the only parent and you're sitting in a boardroom where you've just spent 3 hours preventing a corporate coup. "She's good," he said. "She's doing well in school. She worries about things too much for her age, but I think she gets that from me." "She gets it from her environment," Margaret said. "Children of careful people learn to be careful. That's not a flaw." "No," he said. "It isn't." Across the room, Victoria had stood from her chair and was now working the room with Agent Rowan, moving from director to director with a clipboard that one of the federal team had produced. She was taking names, taking statements, managing the immediate logistics of what happened when a corporate governance crisis converts to a federal matter in real time. She was doing it with the focused competence of someone who had found their footing in the worst morning of their professional life and was not losing it again. She caught Nathan's eye once, across the length of the room, and held it for a moment. He couldn't read everything in her expression from that distance. There was too much in it, and too much had happened in the last 3 hours for any of it to be simple. But the steadiness in it was real, and he recognized it because it was the same steadiness he'd been watching her build and rebuild since the moment she'd walked off that stairwell and across the lobby toward him. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Then she turned back to the director she was speaking with and kept working. The encrypted drive in Nathan's pocket, the one with the recovered data from the broken phone, the transaction records, the subsidiary account structure, the authentication failures that documented Mercer's people inside the system, was transferred to Agent Rowan at 11:47 in the morning, formally logged as evidentiary material. Rowan gave him a receipt. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket next to where the broken phone had been, and for a moment those two things existed in the same space. The phone that had started this morning and the paper that was part of ending it. The boardroom gradually emptied in the way that rooms empty after the central thing that defined them has resolved. Not all at once, but directionally, people finding reasons to be somewhere else now that the room no longer required them. Federal agents moving out with Mercer and Reingold and 2 other directors who had accepted Rowan's invitation to continue their conversations elsewhere. Margaret being helped carefully to a car that would take her to a hospital for a proper assessment of the arm she was managing. Before she left, she gripped Nathan's hand for a moment. She didn't say anything, and neither did he, because some things are too familiar for words, and they had known each other long enough to be past the point of requiring them. Dalton was last out, except for Nathan and Victoria. He stopped near Nathan at the door, and they stood for a moment in the particular way that people stand when there's more to say than the current situation makes easy. "She was on her feet when I got there," Dalton said. "I want you to know that. Whatever they'd sent, she was already ahead of it." "She's that kind of person," Nathan said. Dalton nodded. He looked at the floor for a moment. "I've been in security for 17 years. I've never been wrong about a threat assessment as completely as I was this morning. I looked at you and I saw a threat, and I acted on that. And everything that came after that, the phone, the lockdown, the time it cost, it worked out," Nathan said. "That's not the point." "No," Nathan agreed. "It's not." He looked at Dalton. "The point is you recognized it, and you corrected it, and you drove to Connecticut and back in 90 minutes in a rainstorm to fix part of what you'd broken. That doesn't cancel the first part, but it's also not nothing." Dalton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to need someone to run security she can actually trust, after today." "I know," Nathan said. "I'm not asking to be that person. I'm just—" He stopped, started again. "I'm saying I understand if the answer is no." Nathan didn't give him an answer, because it wasn't his answer to give, and because the real answer was going to take longer than this doorway. But he held the man's gaze steadily, which was its own kind of response. and after a moment Dalton nodded and moved out through the mahogany doors. The boardroom was empty except for the two of them. Victoria stood at the window. Manhattan was still in the rain. The storm hadn't resolved any more than the morning had, and the skyline was still wrapped in low gray cloud that made the city look compressed, contained, like something being held under pressure. She had her arms folded and she was looking out with the expression of someone who has been through something significant and is now standing in the first quiet moment they've had since it started, unsure what to do with the quiet. Nathan crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. Not close enough to be intrusive, just there. 47 floors, she said, still looking out. I've been running this building for 2 years, and I didn't know the fire escape on the east face had a loose grating on the 23rd landing. It's been like that for about 4 years, I think, he said. You'd want to get maintenance on that. She laughed. It was a real one, short and slightly surprised at itself, and followed by a silence that was different from the silences that had preceded it. Less loaded. The kind of silence that exists after things have been decided. The company, she said. What comes next? The audit, the federal proceedings, rebuilding the board. That's going to take time, he said. Months, probably. Some of it will be public. Some of it will be ugly before it gets better. I know. She turned away from the window and looked at him. She was still composed, but the composition was different now. Less constructed, more direct. The version of herself she'd been maintaining for the cameras and the conference tables had come down somewhere around the 14th floor fire escape, and what was under it was younger and less polished and considerably more real. You came here this morning because Margaret asked you to. Yes, he said. She told me when I called her from sub-level 2 that you were the only person she trusted with this. She said, Victoria paused. She said you were the person she called when the situation was the kind that couldn't afford to go wrong. Nathan said nothing. I want to ask you something, Victoria said, and I want you to answer honestly, not helpfully. All right, he said. Why didn't you just call the federal investigators yourself? When Margaret first contacted you 12 days ago, you had the outline of what was happening. You had the relationship. You could have called Patricia Rowan directly and handed them what you knew and stayed in Queens. She held his gaze. Why come in person? He thought about it. Not performing the thought, actually doing it, which took a moment. Because the evidence was in the building, he said. And because the system I built 11 years ago was being used against someone it was built to protect. And that's... He stopped, adjusted. There's a version of this where I make a phone call and send what I had and let other people handle it. And maybe that works, and maybe the timing is off. And the vote happens before anyone can stop it, and you lose the company you built. He looked at her. I didn't want to find out which version it was from a distance. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The Global Security Division, she said. I'm going to need to rebuild it from the ground up. New protocols, new personnel, new architecture. She paused. I'm going to need someone who knows where the bones of this building are buried. I know someone who might be interested in a conversation, he said. Just a conversation. To start, he said. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at the torn shoulder of his gray jacket, the dried blood on the sleeve, the general state of a man who had walked into a Manhattan skyscraper in the rain and spent the subsequent hours doing things that the building's designer had never intended. Can I ask one more thing? She said. Sure. Your daughter, she said. What's her name? He looked at her. He hadn't mentioned Ella in this building. Not once. Not to anyone. Margaret, Victoria said quietly. She mentioned her. She said you were a good father, and that your daughter was lucky, and that the two of you live in Queens, and she's 7 years old. She paused. She said you'd been raising her alone since she was 18 months old, and that you'd never once complained about it. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Ella, he said. Her name is Ella. That's a good name, Victoria said. Yeah, he said. It is. Outside the window, the rain was beginning to lighten slightly. Not stopping, not yet, but pulling back from the hard sideways assault of the morning towards something more ordinary. The city below was doing what the city always did, which was continue, regardless of what any particular building on any particular block had spent the morning becoming. Nathan looked out at it and thought about a 7-year-old in a school in Woodside who would be home at 3:15, who would want to know what he'd done today, and to whom he would give an answer that was mostly true and considerably abbreviated. He thought about the broken phone in his jacket pocket and the encrypted drive that was now in federal hands, and the torn seam of the gray jacket that he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years and had never gotten around to. He thought about a lobby floor and a boot coming down, and 12 hours of contingency protocols triggering because one man in a position of power had looked at another man and seen the wrong thing. And then he stopped thinking about it, because the day was not over, and the kind of person who thinks about the thing that's behind them instead of the thing that's in front of them is the kind of person who eventually gets surprised by what's in front of them. He turned away from the window. "You should call your legal team," he said. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you." "I know," Victoria said. She straightened. The composure she put back on was not the same one she'd been wearing when she walked off the stairwell at 7:30. It was the same material, but it fit differently now, like something that had been altered to account for the actual shape of the person wearing it. "Thank you, Nathan." He nodded. Picked up his bag from the corner where he'd set it down when they came through the doors. The broken buckle was still broken. The canvas was damp from the rain in the morning. He was almost at the door when she said, "Ella's lucky, by the way," what Margaret said. He didn't turn around. But something in how he held himself shifted slightly, the way it does when something lands that you weren't prepared for. "I'm the lucky one," he said, and he walked out through the mahogany doors. The federal proceedings took 4 months and 11 days, which was faster than anyone had predicted and slower than everyone had hoped. Damian Mercer was indicted on 19 counts. The number grew from the original charges as investigators worked through the Luxembourg routing structure and found additional layers that even Nathan hadn't fully mapped from the server room terminal, a secondary extraction mechanism that had been running quietly for 8 months before the primary scheme, siphoning smaller amounts through vendor contracts that had been constructed specifically to look like ordinary operating expenses. It was meticulous work, the kind that takes a particular kind of mind to build, and the federal forensic accountants who unraveled it spent considerable time expressing professional admiration for the architecture of it, in the way that people who do difficult work sometimes admire the difficulty of what they're dismantling, even when what they're dismantling is wrong. Riengold pleaded guilty in the second month and cooperated. 2 of the other committed directors negotiated reduced exposure through their own counsel. The federal official who had been running interference on the regulatory side, a deputy director at a financial oversight agency, whose name the press got hold of in the 6th week and ran with for 2 solid news cycles, resigned before charges were formally filed, which did not prevent the charges from being formally filed. The civil litigation was going to take considerably longer. Caroline Marsh told Victoria this in the 3rd week, sitting in Victoria's office with a stack of filings that was already threatening the structural integrity of the left side of her desk. And she said it with the specific directness of a woman who had never once softened a piece of bad news in 30 years of legal practice and wasn't going to start now. "Years," Marsh said, "not months. The subsidiary unwinding alone is going to be a multi-jurisdictional nightmare, and the Luxembourg entities have their own counsel who are going to be obstructive on principle." "I know," Victoria said. "The board restructuring needs to be finished before the Q1 filing, which gives us 11 weeks. "I know, Caroline." Marsh looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. "You seem calm." "I'm not calm," Victoria said. "I'm just past the part where being not calm changes anything." Marsh considered this. "That's a reasonable place to be," she said, and went back to her files. Margaret Hale spent 3 days in a hospital in Westport having her arm properly assessed. The garden wall had done more damage than she'd initially acknowledged, which surprised no one who knew her, and then returned to her home and refused additional medical supervision with the polite implacability of a woman who had been making her own decisions for 71 years and saw no compelling reason to change that arrangement. She called Victoria twice a week. She called Nathan once, about 6 weeks after the morning in the boardroom on a Saturday afternoon. He was in the kitchen in Woodside when the phone rang. Ella was at the table doing something with colored pencils that had spread across most of the available surface in the way that children's projects expand to fill every space not actively defended. She was 7, and she was meticulous about her work in a way that manifested as apparent chaos. 17 pencils out when she was only using 3, paper at angles that looked random but were apparently intentional. The focused expression of a person who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't require outside input. He answered the phone and took it into the hallway. "How's the arm?" he said. Better than it was, Margaret said. The physical therapist they sent me is 24 years old and absurdly cheerful. We're managing. Good. I called to tell you something, she said, and to ask you something, in that order. All right. The thing I want to tell you, she said, is that I should have called you sooner. When I first found the irregularities, I spent 3 weeks trying to handle it through official channels before I accepted that the official channels were part of what had been compromised. 3 weeks is a long time, and what happened to me at the house was partly a consequence of that delay. I want you to know I understand that. Nathan was quiet for a moment. The colored pencil sounds from the kitchen had stopped, which meant Ella was either finished with something or had moved on to a new phase of whatever she was building. You called when you called, he said. It worked out. You always say that, she said. It's still true. The thing I want to ask you, Margaret said, is about Victoria. She told me she offered you the security division. She mentioned a conversation, he said carefully. Nathan. Her voice had the particular patience of someone who knew the person they were talking to extremely well and was not going to let them be evasive about something important. She offered you the job and you said you'd think about it. That was 6 weeks ago. I want to know what you've decided. He leaned against the hallway wall. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Ella's profile. She'd picked up a pencil again and was drawing something with the full concentration of a person for whom whatever was on that paper was the most important thing currently happening in the world. It's not straightforward, he said. Most things worth doing aren't. Ella's in school here. She's got friends. She knows the neighborhood. Every time I've moved her, when she was 2, when she was 4, it takes her a while to find her footing again. She doesn't complain about it. She never complains about anything, which actually worries me more than if she complained. The job doesn't require you to relocate, Margaret said. Victoria's building a remote-capable structure. You'd be in the city when you needed to be and home when you didn't. She told you that? She asked my opinion on the structure, yes. He was quiet. The other thing, he said, the visibility. That job has a public profile. Press, regulatory appearances, board presentations. I've built a life specifically around not being visible. Ella doesn't know what I used to do. She knows I work in security and that sometimes the work is complicated. That's all she needs to know right now. That's true, Margaret said, but visible and exposed are different things. Victoria knows that distinction matters to you. She's not going to put you in front of a camera. A pause. Nathan, you spent 11 years making yourself small so you could protect one person. That's not a criticism. She needed you to do that, and you did it, and she's fine. But you can be a father and also be someone who does the work you're capable of doing. Those two things are not in conflict. He didn't answer right away. From the kitchen. Dad? Ella's voice, not urgent, just checking. Yeah, he called. 2 minutes. Okay? The pencil sounds resumed. I'll call her, he said to Margaret, this week. Good, Margaret said. And then, after a short pause that had something warmer in it than the rest of the conversation. She's all right, Nathan. Victoria, she's going to be fine, but she's also 30 years old and she's trying to rebuild something that was attacked from inside by someone she trusted completely. And that kind of wound takes longer than the visible damage suggests. Having people around her who are genuinely trustworthy matters more right now than almost anything else. I know, he said. I know you know, she said. I just wanted to say it. He called Victoria on a Tuesday. She answered on the second ring, which he was beginning to understand was a thing she always did, like Margaret, for the same reason. She believed that making people wait was a small form of disrespect, and she had no patience for small forms of disrespect. I have some conditions, he said, without preamble. A short pause on her end. Then, tell me. I don't do press. No interviews, no official statements, no being present at anything that's going to be photographed. If the company needs a public face on security matters, that comes from your communications team. Agreed. My physical presence in the building is determined by operational need, not by a schedule someone else sets. I'm not in an office from 9 to 5. I wasn't going to ask you to be. My daughter's school events, her recitals, her parent-teacher meetings, those are immovable. If there's a conflict, the job moves, not those. There was a pause, and when Victoria spoke again, her voice had something in it that wasn't quite professional. Nathan, I wasn't going to ask you to give up your daughter's recitals. I know, he said. I'm saying it anyway. Understood. What else? Dalton, he said. A longer pause this time. He made a significant error in judgment this morning, she said. I know he corrected it. I know what he did in Connecticut. But the board is asking questions about security leadership and the liability implications of what happened in the lobby, and there are people on the legal team who think he's good at the job, Nathan said. Wait, what he did in the lobby was a failure of information, not of character. He was working with intelligence that had been deliberately falsified by people who understood exactly how to manipulate a security professional's instincts. When he understood what was actually happening, he adapted. He drove to Connecticut. He made a judgment call at that house that kept Margaret from being further harmed. He paused. I've worked with a lot of people in high-pressure situations. The ones who adapt when they're wrong are rarer than the ones who are right the first time. Victoria was quiet for a moment. You'd work with him directly. I'd want him running physical security while I handle the system's architecture. Different competencies, clear division. It works if there's trust between the two functions. He paused. There'd be trust. Another pause. Then, all right. That's it, he said. Those are the conditions. That's it, she said. No salary negotiation? No equity discussion? Have your legal team send me something reasonable, he said. I'll tell you if it isn't. She laughed. The same short, real laugh from the boardroom window, the one that surprised itself. Okay, she said. When can you start? I already started, he said. I've been remotely monitoring your building's security architecture since the morning of the lockdown to make sure no residual access points from Mercer's people were left open. You have 3. A silence. 3 residual access points, she said. I've closed 2. The 3rd requires physical access to a junction on sublevel 2. I can be there Thursday. Nathan, the building needed it, he said. You've been doing this for 6 weeks without telling me. I didn't want to worry you while the federal proceedings were in early stages, he said. Nothing was actively exploited. It was precautionary. A longer silence, and he couldn't fully read what was in it, which was not a sensation he was accustomed to. Thursday, she said finally. Thursday, he said. He started on a Thursday in November, which was gray and cold in the way that New York in November is gray and cold. Not dramatically, not with the spectacular misery of a true winter storm, just persistently, the kind of weather that accumulates rather than announces. He came up from the 47th Street station again, same exit, and the walk to the building was the same walk it had been in October, except that his jacket was different, a heavier one, dark blue, that actually fit and didn't have a broken buckle, because Ella had pointed out in September that the gray one was embarrassing and he'd finally agreed with her. The lobby was ordinary on a Thursday morning. The same polished marble, the same efficient movement of employees through the turnstiles, the same security desk in the center. The emergency lighting was gone. The doors were open. The terminal screens were lit with normal data. Eric Dalton was at the security desk. He saw Nathan come through the main entrance and straightened slightly. Not formally, not the rigid performance of the morning in October, but in the way you straighten when someone you've been expecting arrives. Cross, he said. Dalton, Nathan said. They shook hands. It was brief, and neither of them said anything about the last time they'd stood in this lobby, because everything that needed to be said about that had been said in a server room on sublevel 2, and repeating it would have added nothing. Sublevel 2 first? Dalton said. Sublevel 2 first, Nathan confirmed. They went through the turnstile together, and the lobby moved around them like any other morning. The 3rd residual access point took 40 minutes to close properly. It was embedded in a junction that required partial disassembly of a conduit housing and a firmware update that Nathan had to run twice because the first pass threw an error he hadn't anticipated. He sat on the sublevel 2 floor with his back against the server rack and his laptop balanced on his knees and ran the update the second time, while Dalton stood nearby eating half a granola bar he'd produced from somewhere and watching the process with the particular patience of someone who has decided to trust something they don't fully understand. Is it supposed to take this long? Dalton said. It's taking the time it takes, Nathan said. That's not an answer. It's the same answer I gave you in October. Dalton considered this. Fair, he said. He ate the other half of the granola bar. How's the arm? Nathan looked at his left arm. The scrape had healed cleanly. There was a small scar, faint, that would probably be fully invisible by spring. "Fine," he said. "I noticed the jacket," Dalton said. "My daughter objected to the other one." "Smart kid." "Yeah," Nathan said, "she is." The firmware update completed. He ran the verification sequence, checked the access log, closed the terminal. The third point was closed. He sat on the sub-level floor for a moment longer than he needed to, which was not something he usually did. But the sub-level 2 server room had a particular quality on a Thursday morning with no emergency lighting and no crisis driving the clock. Quiet, functional, exactly what it was. He'd built this room, in a sense. Built the system that lived inside it, left it behind and come back to find it still running, still doing what it was supposed to do, used by people who hadn't known it existed until the morning it was the only thing standing between them and the loss of everything. There was something in that which he hadn't fully processed, and wasn't going to try to process in a sub-level server room on a Thursday, but he was aware of it. He stood, picked up his laptop, looked at the room once more. "Come on," he said to Dalton. "There's a briefing on the 47th floor at 10. The weeks that followed had a different texture than Nathan had expected, which was to say they had more texture than he'd prepared for. He'd anticipated the technical work, the architectural review of the full system, the 17 vulnerabilities he cataloged in the first 3 weeks and addressed in priority order, the new authentication protocols he built to replace the ones that had been compromised. That part was familiar. That part was what he'd told himself the job was. What he hadn't anticipated was the people. Victoria had rebuilt her immediate team in the weeks following the crisis, and the new configuration was smaller and more deliberate than what had preceded it. Fewer people with broader responsibilities, chosen with the specific care of someone who had learned firsthand what it cost to have the wrong person in a position of trust. She ran her leadership meetings on Wednesday mornings, and Nathan attended because his work intersected with every function in the room, and what he found there was something he hadn't sat inside in a long time. People who were trying. Not performing trying, actually doing it, with the friction and the disagreement and the occasional meeting that ran 30 minutes long because something genuinely needed to be worked out and couldn't be moved to a follow-up. A legal officer who said the difficult thing even when it made the room uncomfortable. A new CFO named Raymond Park, who had come from the board minority and who asked the kind of questions that made everyone else think harder. A head of communications who pushed back on Victoria directly in the third week about a press statement that she felt was more defensive than honest, and who was listened to, and whose objection changed the statement. Nathan sat in those meetings and mostly said very little, because his domain was specific and he didn't have opinions on communication strategy or CFO priorities that were worth the room's time. But he listened, and what he heard was the sound of a company trying to rebuild itself not just structurally, but in terms of what it actually was, what it was going to be willing to be going forward. That was Victoria's work, not his. But he was close enough to it to see it happening, which was its own thing. He told none of this to Ella, who was 7 and whose primary interest in his new job was whether the building had a good cafeteria, which he reported back on with genuine detail because she took cafeteria situations seriously. She had visited once, in the 4th week, on a school holiday when his schedule hadn't worked out as planned. He'd brought her in on a quiet Friday afternoon and walked her through the lobby, past the security desk where Dalton had given her a visitor badge, with the careful ceremony that people give small things to children when they want them to feel taken seriously, and up to the 47th floor, where Victoria had happened to be in her office and had come out into the hallway to say hello. He'd watched that from a few feet away. Victoria crouching down slightly, she wasn't tall, to talk to Ella at something closer to eye level. Ella looking at her with the direct, evaluating attention she gave all new adults, the attention of a child who had learned early that adults varied considerably, and it was worth taking the measure of them. "Your dad works here now?" Ella had said. "He does," Victoria said. "We're very glad he does." "He's good at his job," Ella said. It was a statement of fact, delivered without particular emphasis, the way you state something that doesn't require emphasis because it's simply true. Victoria had looked up at Nathan for a moment, and the expression on her face was something he didn't try to categorize, because some things are better simply acknowledged than filed. "I know," Victoria said. The formal legal resolution of the Mercer case came in the spring. 19 counts, 16 convictions, 3 reduced to lesser charges through the cooperation agreements that had been in place since month 2. The sentencing was in April, and it was not dramatic. Sentencing rarely was, in Nathan's experience. Courts were quiet places where large things happened in procedural language, and the weight of them was in the paperwork rather than the room. He didn't attend. He read the summary in the morning on his phone while Ella ate breakfast, and then he put the phone away and helped her find the other half of a pair of sneakers that had gone missing sometime in the previous 48 hours, which was a more immediately pressing problem. Margaret called that evening. She sounded tired in a way that was not physical, the deeper tiredness of something that has been held in tension for a long time and has finally released. "It's done," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the first day I met you. Do you remember? The conference room on West 54th. You were 31. You came in with a binder full of system specifications, and you spent 45 minutes walking me through an architecture I didn't fully understand, and you didn't once make me feel like I should understand it faster." "I remember," he said. "I thought then that you were someone who was careful in a way that was unusual," she said. "That you understood the weight of things. That you took seriously what deserved to be taken seriously, and didn't perform seriousness about things that didn't." A pause. "I was right about that." "Margaret, I'm not being sentimental," she said, with the mild firmness she used when she wanted to establish that she was not being what she was being. "I'm being accurate. There's a distinction." "I know," he said. "How is Ella?" "She lost a sneaker," he said. "We found it. It was behind the radiator." "How does a sneaker get behind a radiator?" "I stopped asking those questions around the time she turned 5, he said. "It's less stressful." Margaret laughed, a real one, the kind she didn't produce often, and that meant something when she did. "Good night, Nathan." "Good night," he said. The lobby renovation happened in May. It was not a dramatic renovation. Victoria had specifically resisted the suggestion from the board's real estate subcommittee that the lobby be substantially redesigned as part of the company's public rebranding. She didn't want a new lobby. She wanted the same lobby made better, which was a different thing and harder to explain to people who thought rebuilding meant replacement. The marble stayed. The security desk configuration was updated, more functional, less monumental, built with the input of the people who actually worked it, rather than the aesthetic preferences of the architecture firm. New terminal screens. New lighting that was better for the people who spent their days under it. Small things, mostly. The kind of changes that make a place work better without announcing themselves. On the Friday afternoon that the renovations were completed, Nathan came down from the 47th floor and walked through the lobby at the end of the workday. It was 4:50 in the afternoon, and the outbound flow of employees was at its peak. The particular human current of a large building emptying itself, people moving with the specific energy of a week ending and a weekend beginning. He was almost to the main entrance when Dalton fell into step beside him. They walked out through the entrance together into the May afternoon, which was the first genuinely warm day of the season. The kind of day that New York produces sometimes in spring that feels like the city is making an argument for itself. The sky clear, and the air carrying the actual smell of something alive rather than the accumulated winter smell of concrete and exhaust. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment without particular purpose. "Good week," Dalton said. "Productive," Nathan said. "Not the same thing." "Close enough on a Friday." Dalton had his jacket over his arm. He looked at the street, at the flow of people moving past them in both directions, the ordinary human traffic of Midtown at end of business. "My wife asked me something the other night," he said. "She asked if I liked the job. Not whether I was doing it well, whether I liked it." "What did you tell her?" "I said I was still figuring that out," he said. "She said that was a more honest answer than she usually got from me, so she was going to take it as progress." Nathan looked at him. "She sounds perceptive," he said. "She's the smartest person I know," Dalton said, without any qualification. "I married significantly above my level, and I've known it since the second date." He paused. "I do like it, by the way. The job. More than I expected to. Different than before." "Different how?" Dalton thought about it with the same consideration he'd been applying to things since October, which was more consideration than he'd applied to them before October. "Before, I liked being right," he said. "Now I don't know exactly. I like the work going right. Not me, specifically." He looked at Nathan. That's probably something you've known for a long time. Took me a while to get there, Nathan said. I used to be very concerned with being right. What changed? Ella, he said simply. You can't be always right in front of a child. They see everything. You're wrong about things constantly, and they watch you be wrong and figure out what to do about it. Either you get comfortable with that, or you spend the next 18 years performing something, and performing things in front of children is exhausting, and they see through it anyway. Dalton was quiet for a moment. He had 2 kids, Nathan knew, a teenager and an 11-year-old. He didn't talk about them often, but he had the way of holding himself that parents of children of those specific ages had, a certain weighted patience. Yeah, Dalton said. That's true. A cab moved past. Someone on a bicycle threaded through the intersection against the light in the aggressive, casual way of a city cyclist who had long ago made peace with the concept of traffic signals as suggestions. The afternoon went on around them being an afternoon. I should get uptown, Nathan said. Yeah, Dalton said. Me too. They didn't do the thing where people make vague plans to get a drink sometime. They were not that kind of people, and they both knew it. They stood there for one more moment in the way that people stand when something has been established between them that doesn't require a ceremony to mark it, and then they went in separate directions. Nathan took the express train to Queensboro Plaza and transferred to the local, and he was in Woodside by 5:40, which was earlier than usual, and he picked up Ella from the neighbor's apartment where she went after school on the days he ran late, and she had paint on her left hand from something she'd done in art class that she hadn't told him about yet, but would, at length, over the next several blocks. She was 7, and she talked the way 7-year-olds talk about things that matter to them, without editing, without audience awareness, without the performance of casualness that older people apply to the things they care about, because caring openly has become a vulnerability they've learned to protect. She talked about the painting and about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate named Marcus, who had very strong opinions about the correct way to use the color yellow, and about whether they were going to have the rice thing for dinner or the noodle thing because she'd been thinking about it, and she felt like a noodle knight. He listened to all of it. He answered when she needed an answer and was quiet when she didn't, which was a skill that had taken him years longer to learn than it should have, and that he was still working on. They stopped at the corner market for the noodles and 2 other things they needed, and while he was paying, Ella was at the counter with her chin resting on the edge of it, looking at a display of small things that children always find immediately in any store. Dad, she said. Yeah. At school today, Mrs. Petrova asked what our parents do for work, she said, and I said you work in security for a big company in the city. That's right, he said. And Marcus said his dad is a firefighter, she said, and he said that's more important than security. Nathan took his change. He looked at his daughter, who was looking at the display with the focused neutrality of a person delivering information and waiting to see what the other person did with it. What do you think? He said. She considered it with genuine seriousness. I think firefighters are important, she said. I think what you do is also important. I think Marcus just wanted to win something because of the yellow argument earlier. That's a pretty sophisticated read, he said. He does that, she said, with the authority of 7 years of human observation. When he loses something, he finds a different thing to win. They walked home. The evening was warm in the way that May evenings in New York occasionally are, the city releasing some of the heat it had stored from the first genuinely warm day, the sky over the rooftops going the particular orange-pink that you only get when the atmosphere is doing something interesting with the light. Ella talked about the yellow argument in more detail as they walked, and then about a book she was reading that had a part in it she didn't like but she was going to finish anyway, because she'd made a rule for herself that she finished books even when they had parts she didn't like. He asked why she'd made that rule. She thought about it and said because otherwise you only ever read the easy parts of things, and then you don't know what the hard parts are like, and then you're surprised later when things have hard parts, and she didn't like being surprised. He was quiet for a moment after that. That's pretty good thinking, he said. I know, she said, without arrogance, just straightforwardly, the way you acknowledge something you've thought carefully about. He made the noodles. She sat at the kitchen table and drew while he cooked, the same creative chaos as always, pencils at angles that looked random and weren't. The apartment was the apartment it had always been. Small, adequately lit, the radiator that had briefly hidden a sneaker, the window that faced the street and let in the sound of the neighborhood through the evenings. He had a job. He had a daughter who made rules about finishing books. He had a broken phone in a drawer somewhere that he'd kept without fully deciding why. The cracked chassis, the split screen, the matte black casing that had survived everything except a security chief's boot on a marble floor in October. Some people kept things because the things were valuable. Some kept them because the things were reminders. He wasn't entirely sure which category the phone fell into, and he decided not to force an answer on it because some things mean what they mean without needing to be named. The noodles were done. He called Ella and she came and sat down across from him and they ate, and she told him the rest of the story about the painting, which was detailed and involved several people he hadn't met, and a dispute about supplies that had apparently been building for weeks, and had resolved in a way she considered fair, though she noted that Marcus would probably see it differently. Outside, the city went on being the city. Inside, a father and his daughter ate noodles at a kitchen table in Queens, and the evening was ordinary, and the ordinary was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. There are things you learn only through the experience of losing something, or coming close enough to losing it, that the close call changes the shape of how you hold what remains. Victoria Langford had spent 2 years running an $11 billion company and had nearly lost it not to market forces or bad strategy or the 1,000 ordinary failures that companies die from, but to proximity, to trust, to the assumption that the people standing closest to you were standing there for the same reasons you were. She'd been wrong about that, and the wrongness of it didn't go away after the proceedings concluded, and the board was restructured and the press had moved on to the next story, and the company's stock had recovered and then exceeded its previous high. The wrongness of it was a thing she carried differently than she'd carried things before. Not as a wound exactly, but as knowledge. The kind you can't unknow. She talked about this once, to Caroline Marsh, in a conversation that started as a meeting and became something else when the formal items were done, and neither of them moved to leave. I trusted him because he was good at his job, Victoria said. He was genuinely good at it. The things he built, the partnerships, the financial architecture, the regulatory relationships, they were real. The competence was real. Yes, Marsh said. And I let the competence answer the question about character, Victoria said. I watched what he built, and I thought I was watching who he was. Marsh was quiet for a moment. She had the expression she wore when she was considering whether to say something direct, which she almost always decided to say. You were 30 years old, she said, running a company you hadn't expected to run for another decade, in a room full of people who'd been in those rooms longer than you'd been alive. He was very good at making himself seem indispensable to exactly the person who needed to believe she had someone indispensable beside her. That's a kind framing, Victoria said. It's an accurate framing, Marsh said. The two aren't mutually exclusive. She paused. What you learned is what most people only learn after a much worse outcome. You get to use it. Victoria looked out the window, the same window where she'd stood with Nathan in October, watching the rain. The street below was May busy, ordinary, indifferent. Nathan said something to me, she said, in the boardroom, after everything. I asked him why he'd come in person instead of just making calls and sending information. He said he didn't want to find out from a distance which version of events it was going to be. Marsh said nothing, waiting. I've been thinking about that, Victoria said. About what it means to be the kind of person who shows up instead of manages from a distance. He didn't have to come in person. He could have made it someone else's problem in a dozen legitimate ways. She paused. He came because he thought it mattered enough to be there for it. Yes, Marsh said. I want to be that kind of person, Victoria said. Not as an aspiration that required external validation, just as a statement of direction, quiet and certain. I want to run this company in a way where I'm actually present for the things that matter, where I'm not managing the appearance of being here while keeping myself at a distance that feels like safety. Marsh considered this for a moment. That's going to be harder than the other way, she said. I know, Victoria said. Most things worth doing are. Marsh almost smiled. It was the almost smile of someone who has heard their own words returned to them, slightly altered, in a context that gives them more weight than they had originally. You've been talking to Nathan Cross too much, she said. Probably, Victoria said. She went back to work. There was always work to go back to. The company was not a thing that resolved itself and sat still. It was a living system that required constant attention and made constant demands and produced constant new problems to be understood and addressed. She'd stopped resenting that about it, had come to understand that the demanding nature of the thing was not an obstacle to running it well, but part of what running it well meant. She called Margaret Hale on a Thursday, as she always did, and Margaret told her about a physical therapist who was absurdly cheerful and making genuine progress, and about a book she was reading that she'd started 3 times over the years and never finished because it had a section in the middle that was genuinely difficult, and this time she'd decided she was going to get through it. "Why this time?" Victoria asked. "Because," Margaret said, "someone recently reminded me that you don't know what the hard parts are like until you finish them, and then you're surprised when things have hard parts. And I've decided I'm too old to be surprised by things having hard parts." "Who told you that?" "A 7-year-old, Margaret said. Victoria laughed. Outside the window of the 47th floor, Manhattan conducted itself with the complete indifference to individual human drama that cities perfect over centuries of accumulating it. Buildings stood, traffic moved, the river reflected the sky. Somewhere in Queens, a father helped his daughter decide between the rice thing and the noodle thing, and a broken phone sat in a drawer, and a worn gray jacket hung in the back of a closet that its owner had decided he would eventually clean out but hadn't gotten to yet. The things that last are rarely the things that announce themselves. They don't come wrapped in the vocabulary of importance. They come in ordinary envelopes carried across lobbies in the rain. They come from people who show up when showing up is difficult and who don't require recognition for having done it. They come from the slow, unremarkable work of being honest when dishonesty would be easier, and present when distance would be safer, and steady when steadiness costs something. This is not a story about a corporation that survived a crisis. Corporations survive crises all the time, and the surviving tells you very little about what they are. This is a story about what people are made of when the version of events they planned for turns out to be different from the version that actually arrives. When the ground shifts. When the phone breaks. When the person they thought they could trust was building something in the dark the entire time. The answer, it turns out, is not always dramatic. It is not always visible. It does not always come dressed the way you'd expect or carry the credentials you'd require or arrive at the time and in the manner that makes it easy to recognize. Sometimes it comes in a worn gray jacket with a broken buckle, soaking wet, carrying only an envelope and a phone, and the only thing you need to know about it is whether you have the sense to let it through the door.